You are listening to an audio recording of Tales of Arthas. Tales of Arthas is a World of Warcraft fanfiction story written, edited, and produced by Samuel Gurman. The story is based on the story of Arthas and his ascent and fall as the Lich King. The story is told through the eyes of a few of his childhood friends. Most World of Warcraft lore is kept intact. However, some lore ideas and events have been changed. Actors and actresses were not expected to impersonate their World of Warcraft characters' voices that appear in the game, but to get ideas from what is found in the game and in the Warcraft games and create their own version of the voice. Actors and actresses were not expected to impersonate their World of Warcraft characters' voices that appears in the game, but to get ideas from what is found in the game and in the Warcraft games and create their own version of the voice. Actor and actress credits, as well as contact information, will be at the end of the book. All rights for the World of Warcraft story and characters used are credited to Blizzard Activision. Tales of Arthas is a fan-fiction story and is a non-profit production, and no profit was made or will be made from it. Without further ado, prepare yourself for the beginning of the story. Chapter 1. Meeting Arthas.
I sat with my lips sealed, controlling my breathing as much as possible. My heart beat loudly. It was the only thing I could hear. My back against a hard wooden stall wall, beside a barrel that I hoped would hide me from the side. My feet and part of my legs were buried in hay. It went up a little bit past my ankles. The smell of horses and fresh hay filled my nostrils. The ground vibrated a little. Patters tickled the dirt floor of the stable as Swain, the other stable hand's boy, was looking for me. To many people, it may not sound too serious, but for me at that very moment, it was a life-threatening ordeal. Being found in a game of hide-and-seek was the worst thing to ever happen to you. Even though this was a typical game for us children to play, this was not our normal stable. My father went to the palace stable every spring. I was his only child, and he couldn't leave me alone at home. Swain was also brought to the stables during the spring. His father only worked as a stable hand once a year. He wore vests and nice pants, not used to being on a farm or in a stable that often. This palace was gigantic. All kinds of different horses were inside, and sometimes I could even sneak off and explore a little bit. Outside the stable, the blossoms smothered your nose. The nobles loved to have excessive amounts of flowers and trees that bloomed. I used to climb up one of the larger fence posts, sit and watch the horses scamper and trot in the fields. A new smell took over your senses here. It was that of horses and grass. A field of the greenest grass I had ever seen. Bright green, the kind you see on a painter's palettes. Not a single spot of dirt, even with all the horses running, laying, and trampling it. The smell of the grass and the sight of the beautiful steeds were overwhelming to me at such a young age. Each year they grew just as I did, and it was as if we were brothers, not humans and horses. They all had different personalities. Some were dull and silent, others had a sense of humor. A few were bashful, while the rest would prance right up to you, expecting some kind of reward. Rubbing, petting, or scratching was what they sought most times. However, once in a while they demanded sugar, an apple, or some carrots. This year was a typical year. My father was hard at work. He sat on a stool and was fixing a stack of horseshoes, one by one. Always a diligent and serious worker. No smile crossed his face, and he kept working until he was done. He often said,
"I will rest at night, when it is time to sleep. Then later I will rest forever, so I should work as hard as I can until that time comes."
I was a small boy at this time and not worrying about hard work. I think my father understood that. There were times when he forced me to work and learn the ways of the stable, especially taking care of the horses and keeping a clean living space. Even so, there was also much time for freedom, to do what I wanted to do. There were precious moments left for me to act like a boy, not a man. On this day, I was playing hide-and-go-seek with Swain. I could hear him now, on the other side of the stall wall, which was behind my back. The wooden wall shook a bit. He must have been hoisting himself up. I looked up. I saw his head above me. He wasn't looking at me yet. He was looking into the rafters. Did he really think I could get up there? His eyes moved from the left to the right. They narrowed, moving back towards the ground. There's an old saying we have in Lordaeron.
If you can see a person, then they can see you too.
It was an old ranger's saying when hunting or sniping. Luckily for me, Swain couldn't see me. That is, until his head would change its position. Our serious game was interrupted when his father came bursting into the stable, flinging the doors wide open.
Mr. Engdahl has fallen seriously ill. Come at once, Mr. Golthul.
Mr. Barthas's face was painted with emotion. He had coal-black hair and crystal-like grayish-blue eyes just like Swain. They were wide-eyed and filled with concern. Mr. Engdahl was my father's childhood friend who worked as a wine taster for King Menethil. My father and Mr. Barthas rushed out, and I jumped from my hiding place and sprinted after them. The giant stable door's ricocheting swing almost toppled me over, but Swain's hands supported me from behind. We both pulled the door back open and trailed after our fathers. The four of us made our way to the room where they had taken Mr. Engdahl. Inside the room lay Mr. Engdahl on a bed, and next to him was his daughter, Electra. But the rest of his children had stayed at home with their mother. Also, there was King Menethil and the prince. King Menethil was a towering gray-haired man with muscles that matched his height and impressiveness. He always wore his crown and looked very serious, even more serious than my own father, which I had always thought to be impossible. In this moment, he looked even more serious. The prince was as I had always seen him in the parades that the royals of Lordaeron took every spring. He was slim, tall for his age, and he had blonde hair like the sun and blue eyes like the sky on a perfect day. My eyes widened at him, and I began to daydream about him being king and what kind of leader he would be. Everyone stood nervously around the bed, their fingers twitching or fiddling, eyes having trouble resting in one place. There was nowhere to sit in the small room, the only other object in the room besides the bed being a small table to the right of the bed, which was used for flowers and small dishes. Arthas's hands were resting at his sides. He gazed at the ceiling as the rest of us looked at the bed, at Mr. Engdahl, or at each other, constantly switching our gazes. A smile almost crossed his face, as if he had still found a way to enjoy himself. The young prince was incredibly calm during such an intense situation. I could tell he was going to be a great king one day. My attention was quickly stolen back by the concerned looks that swept across the others' faces. Everyone was so full of sorrow. Lips curved downward, bodies hunched over, and not a word slipped out of anyone's mouths. We gathered around the bedside for a while, but soon us children got bored. Swain was playing with an empty vase for quite some time when it slipped from his hands and crashed on the floor. The adults were alarmed, but not angry. They were frustrated, but figured that we were bored, and this is why we were messing around. That was when the king suggested that the prince take us on a tour around the palace. I held myself back from jumping up and down, because that's what I was doing inside. I'm sure Swain and Electra were doing the same. We were all excited to be with the prince. Quick, soft footsteps hit the shiny wooden floor as we moved up to him as fast as the king had suggested it. Our eyes beamed and we stood upright, gazing at him. The prince loved the attention too. The slight smile on his face had grown much larger, as fast as we had come up to him. Then he led us out of the room. We walked through the garden where you could see a wall with guards above. Statues of people who I did not know dwarfed us. Next we headed to some meeting halls. They had maps and pictures that didn't make any sense to me, as the prince tried to explain them to us. There was a long table and many chairs there as well. The prince exited the room and we followed him. We clambered up curving stairs to the top of a tower, and he showed us the view of the kingdom from the top. You could see the next town. You could see trees, forests. You could see the cobblestone road meet the horizon, and lamps and lampposts glistening in the sun. This was when Electra spoke to the prince for the first time.
What are you going to do when you are king?
Ride my horse and have plenty of feasts. We all laughed for a bit, and then he interrupted us to ask if we wanted to go to his secret hideout. Most of the maps and pictures and rooms had been pretty boring, so we all agreed. He walked down some hallways, and we came upon a locked door. The prince asked a guard to open the door. As it opened, it released a smell I had never smelled before. We stepped through, and that door led us to some sewers. They were disgusting. There were old bricks of the palace that had not been well maintained. Mold and muck covered some of them. Strange liquid dripped from different pipes along the way. I touched one of the walls out of curiosity. The outer part of the brick was soggy, yet still firm. Green mold came off the brick onto my hands. I wanted to wipe it off with something, but there was nowhere to wipe it. None of the bricks were clean. The floor was also slightly damp. I reached down and wiped it off on the cuff of my pants. My ears focused, and I could hear drops in the distance. There were drops dripping at different times, but they all had their own repetition. We heard some commotion and scurrying. All of our eyes widened, and we froze, except for the prince. He assured us that it was only rats. That didn't help us move forward.
"It is okay," he said. "They are more afraid of us than we are of them. We'll be lucky to see one."
As we pushed forward again, a drop of liquid hit my forehead. After that, I made sure to keep my mouth closed, just to be on the safe side. The deeper we went into the sewers, the more Electra's lip quivered, and her steps slowed. Finally, she cried out,
I don't want to go any further.
"We're almost down there, though. Just down this hole."
I'm not going.
The prince interrupted himself as he slid the circular opening of a manhole with his foot. The metal scraping on metal made a very sinister sound, which echoed throughout the sewer hallway we were currently in. Below, all you could see was darkness. It led to another section of the sewers for sure. You could see a rickety, rusty ladder that barely clung to a few bricks, half a foot down from the opening.
I'm not going.
"Come on. There's nothing to be afraid of down here."
It's okay. I will stay here with her, and you two can go on.
With Swain offering to stay with her, the prince and I went down the manhole. The strange thing was the green moss and dried liquid glistened, and this coloration gave enough light to help us get down. As we got towards the bottom, flickering light made it hard to keep our eyes open. Our boots hit the ground with a thud that sent shocks from the bottom of my feet into my ankles. It was painful, but I was uninjured. My eyes quickly shot up at the prince, who was also unaffected by the landing. He led me near a corner at the bottom, where there were bars covering an opening, and you could see out into the wild. Rays of light lit the floor as they shone through. Looking outside of it, there were mountains, trees, and nothing but wilderness. It really made my imagination spark.
"This is where I like to look out, knowing that I'll never be able to venture out there. Most people look at this palace and kingdom as something great, where I live happily and heartily, but sometimes I feel like it's a prison. Too many people care for my safety, but you look like someone who can go on an adventure."
I do live near the woods.
One day, when I'm king, I want you to be my main explorer. You'll get to know everything that's out there.
We shook hands, and then I realized that we had spent all this time together, and I still didn't even know the prince's name.
By the way, what's your name?
I'm Arthas.
I'm D'Artagnan.
We shook hands again, and we climbed out of the sewers. Swain and Electra were waiting. Electra was crying, so we promised her we would go back to the room where her father was. Our exploring was done for the day. On the walk back, we didn't really say much. Electra was sobbing. Swain was next to her trying to comfort her, but perhaps tired of her crying. Meanwhile, my imagination of being a king's explorer was humming, and Arthas was a dozen footsteps ahead of us all, in a hurry to get back. My father was waiting outside the door when we arrived. He let the others go in, but stopped me. It was getting close to evening, so we had to head home. That was my first moment with Arthas. He thought a lot. Maybe he thought too much. My father said that thinking too much could be a helpful thing, but it might also be a harmful thing. Sometimes you have to appreciate things the way they are, keeping yourself busy and not pondering endlessly about things. Overthinking can lead to disasters, he said. This resonated in my mind as I thought about the prince I had just met and the future ahead of him and me. Could I really be an explorer one day? The minutes, days, and months seemed to drag on. The future couldn't come fast enough for such an ambitious boy like me.
Chapter 2. Refugees from Stormwind.
I woke up quite regularly from the chatter of bluebirds, robins, jays, and other beaked beings that patrolled the skies. Their tunes changed from season to season, but they always woke up early as the sun was approaching the horizon and the sky started turning gray. Their eyes opened, and musical notes clouded the sky shortly after. The sun burned into my eyes through the window. The thuds of my father's boots and the singing of the birds had been going for some time. My father usually let me sleep until a little bit after sunrise. I never knew what things he did before I woke up, but I was awoken to eat breakfast, which was bread, butter, small slices of ham and cheese. We headed outside. The horses were already in the fields, and my father and I headed into the stables. The tasks here differed from those at the palace in the spring. I was given the task of helping my father restock the hay, clean the horse brushes, and clean the stable floor. The floor was generally covered with mostly mud and horse manure. It was hard to tell the difference, but it had to be cleaned all the same. I would clean the floor while my father brought fresh hay back on a wagon. The stable was always dark, so the doors and windows had to be kept open. This stable was quite small compared to the palace's stable, as there were only 4 horses that were kept here. On this morning it had gone the same. I had cleaned the floor and I was sweeping it when my father arrived on the wagon. He beckoned me to come out. We worked silently in the beginning, but then I could no longer hold in what I had been wondering for a few weeks. I asked him about what had happened to Electra's father.
Mr. Engthel is fine, but there are people gossiping and putting forth theories that his illness was the cause of someone trying to poison the king. An investigation was swirled up, at least to satisfy the constant complaints, but not much came of it. Other rumors are flying about that it was just a coincidence. Maybe he had the flu or some other kind of illness, and happened to drink from the king's cup before the illness fully struck him. A few people believe it might have been a person who had poisoned the king's cup, because they were envious of Mr. Engthel.
After that my father was silent, and so was I. My father hated talking in the morning, so there was no need to push him into further conversation. As the months went by, I got too busy to be bothered by the incident as much. Mr. Engthel was in great health, so it was no longer a significant concern. I woke up before school each day to help prepare oats and other meals for the horses. We cleaned the stable, and then I went off to school. After school, my father had been busy all day, so I helped him once again. The evening chores consisted of small tasks my father thought could be handled by me, such as checking the fence borders, sweeping up the stable, counting inventory of horseshoes, tools, and other supplies. Generally, they were too simple and bored me a lot. I fantasized about the idea of Arthas and I in the future, and I daydreamed about going back the following spring. I was awoken from my daydreaming with a rough hand on my shoulder. Startled, I swung around. It was my father.
Time to head in. I need you to help me with dinner tonight.
Once in a while, my father liked to do a real dinner, not just bread, cheese, and ham. It reminded him of my mother, and it was a nostalgic experience for him. His favorite meal to cook was boar stew. It required a lot of prep work, and it would mean that we would spend time together preparing and then waiting as it boiled. My father tussled with the door and finally kicked it open. The door was always tight to close and open, due to the cottage's framework. He dropped a sack on the table and told me he would retrieve the boar meat. I was to start cutting the contents of the sack. I untied the rope and the vegetables spilled out onto the table. One potato slipped and hit our wooden floor. I picked it back up and fetched a cutting knife from the drawers. There were some turnips, potatoes, carrots, beets, and spinach. I gathered a few bowls from the corner near the cooking pit. I had finished cutting the potatoes and carrots when my father barged back through the door. In haste, he commanded me to make some room on the table, as blood dripped from the boar onto the floor. I moved the finished bowls onto the bricks surrounding the fire pit as he slammed the boar's carcass onto the freed area. I moved towards a mop to clean the blood.
Don't bother. There will be more soon. Finish cutting the vegetables and ready the fire pit,
he barked. My blade went up and down, as I cut through the beets and the turnips. I had to be careful, as I was half cutting my own vegetables and half watching my father hack the boar. His jagged knife cut into the boar, exposing meat and flesh underneath the skin. He dropped inedible parts into a metal tray to his left. When the skin was peeled, he grabbed a smooth-edged knife and began carving parts of the boar out. I rushed outside to gather some firewood. There was already kindling fuel next to the fire pit. We used old parchments and advertisements to spark the kindling. The fire distracted me from my father's butchering because the flames shot out immediately. Working to keep them up was a tedious task, and then I had to get them down to embers and coals. By this time, the cutting of the boar was completed. Like my father had promised, there would be more blood. It was on the table, on the floor, on my father's hands and his forearms. I helped him hoist the pot over the fire pit, and we chucked the ingredients inside. The water began to boil. We contained its splash, and when it was stable, we sat by the fireplace to relax. My father got the fire going this time. We had no chairs near the fireplace, only the 3 chairs that sat around the table. He dragged 2 chairs over and sat, staring into the fire. I glanced over to the hammocks we slept in. Mine was under a window. My eyelids were drooping and hard to keep up. It was music to my ears when I was told to get the bowls ready for the boar stew. I literally inhaled it, listened to my father talk about new inventory and changes at the palace's stable, and then cleaned up. It was time for bed. The spring came before I knew it. My father and I were the first ones to arrive at the stable. I watched as he fumbled with the lock for several seconds. It was a large old padlock with marks showing its age, yet it wasn't rusted or battered. The field loomed behind it.
I won't need you for quite some time,
my father said, insinuating that I should entertain myself for a while. I stood for barely a few seconds. I made my way around the edge of the stable to the field and approached the fence. The horses were already out. Their hooves thudded on the ground. With my hands I gripped the edge of one of the posts and hoisted myself up, centered on the post with my legs dangling, my eyes swiveled around the field. It was mid-morning, yet the smell of the grass was still fresh from the morning dew, and the sun was beginning its mid-sky ascension. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a few people at the far edge of the field. Several horses bounded up to them. One horse was all white, the others were brown. They guided the horses up to the fence near the gate and began putting saddles on them. The gate opened, and after they mounted, the white one went inside the field and began trotting towards me. My eyes squinted, but the figure on the horse was too far away. As he got closer, his figure became more defined. Blonde hair, a white shirt, blue pants, fair skin. Was it Arthas? He stopped in front of me and said,
"Hello, D'Artagnan. You're back for the spring."
We chatted for several minutes. He said that some of the stable workers had told him that I was coming. After a few moments, he invited me to ride with him.
"Let's go for a ride,"
he said.
"I'll help you saddle a good steed."
My body bounced up and down in a slightly painful way. Arthas wouldn't stop talking. I was trying to focus on riding the unfamiliar horse, and he was talking non-stop. It was as if he didn't have anyone to talk to his age, and he was letting it all out in one go. I listened to him and responded where I needed to. It was hard to talk to a prince about working a life as a stable hand, in a small cottage, going to school. Finally, I had a good question.
"What's your school like?"
I asked. He laughed and smiled for a few seconds.
"I have a private tutor. He's nice sometimes, but very strict. I wish I could go to school with the other children."
For a moment, I felt guilty. I went to school with other children, and I had never thought it to be that great. We discussed mathematics, language, and finally we got to biology. This led to us discussing the grasses, flowers, and then plants and trees. I told him of my ambitions of exploring the woods further from the palace and the stable my father worked at. Arthas's eyes started to head for the ground, and his mouth leveled out. He wasn't as talkative.
"Do you call your steed anything?"
I changed the subject.
"His name's Invincible. He's my own personal horse. I hope he'll live as long as I do."
His eyes returned to mine, and he was smiling again.
"Watch this."
He motioned with his hand, indicating that we should turn around. We lined the horses up, and his eyes were on the fence in the distance. His back straightened, and his hands flapped wildly. Invincible took off at full speed. They approached the fence and weren't slowing down. With a giant leap, he cleared the fence, and there were several feet to spare. What an amazing leap! I took off the same way, but as the horse approached the fence, it stopped. Arthas gave a hearty laugh, and Invincible gave the horse I was riding a disappointed glance. It was an embarrassing start to the spring, yet I couldn't blame the horse. The fences were quite high. The springs continued to come and then go as fast as they came. They became part of the routine. I would meet Arthas a few more times, but then one spring when I came, he didn't greet me or visit me in the stables. I asked the guard about it, and he mentioned that Arthas had taken up paladin training and he was busy. I stopped to ask more questions.
"What is a paladin?"
was one I asked. The guard gave a long, well-explained reply.
"Warriors fight with shields, axes, hammers, and sometimes swords. When their weapons are battered, they grappled, slam, and choke their opponents to death. They ride on adrenaline. Most are filled with rage, while others are patient and use great strategy. Priests must also be mentioned. Priests are great followers of the light. They are hard to tempt. They use power from energy most of us cannot see. They control the mind, and they enlighten the soul, too. Priests also soothe wounds, and in the darkest hour they still wait and hope that their beliefs will lead them to victory. They have no shield. They have no weapons, no armor. These men and women wear only a robe and carry a holy book. Some of them carry maces, blessed and forged with the power of the light, not for smashing their enemies with, but for adding more spiritual power from blessing them. Paladins are a mix of both warriors and priests. They are strong bearers of the light. They also visit chapels and cathedrals, but they learn to wield a weapon and brace with a shield as well."
Hearing the guard's words made me want to be a paladin right there and then. I was still young, though. Arthas was a little bit older than the rest of us children, so it was understandable that he was starting to take on serious training. I hoped to start military training later, too.
I didn't want to be a stable hand for my whole life, and if Arthas was becoming a paladin, maybe I would attempt to be one too. The sound of wheels creaking and horses stomping turned my head towards the road and away from the guard. A large caravan filled with and accompanied by people was approaching the gate of the palace. There was a small boy who looked very much like a prince who was at the front. He had fine clothes and rode on a noble-looking steed. Its mane floated in the wind, and both of them rose their heads proudly. There were many other people, well-dressed ones, some carrying swords, axes, shields. Others came marching alongside in robes, with books and maces. There were many women and children, too. They looked just like me, and they even had the same color of clothes as the Lordaeron guards and nobles. However, their emblem was different, a lion as opposed to our giant L. It was on the side of their caravans, on some banners and flags. The king came out to greet them, but I watched from afar. They went inside with the king. I snuck around behind some women talking and listened in.
Do you think they will come here?
It's so far away, I doubt it. They will probably spend a while celebrating their victory.
I don't know. I don't feel safe here. I wouldn't get too comfortable.
What were these women talking about? Where were they from and what happened? Being up close, I also noticed that the women wore emblems similar to those on the banners and flags. It was a lion. Why did they hold such a close connection to a lion? I never met a lion in Lordaeron. At home, my father explained what he had heard from other men around the palace.
He said that creatures from another realm had invaded, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. According to the rumors, they were more ferocious than trolls and also brought different magic. Dark magic.
My father always told me about the troll wars, that humans fought alongside the night elves to protect their own survival. He went into vivid detail about their history, but I couldn't really grasp it. Trolls originally controlled the entire planet. They worshipped strange gods, chanted, performed blood sacrifices, and had many different tribes. Some trolls changed form over time due to what they worshipped. They evolved into night elves. The night elves and trolls fought. The trolls slowly lost land to the night elves. Where do humans come from? I thought to myself after he had finished. Did we descend from trolls too? I never met a night elf, and I also never saw a troll. But my father's words got my imagination whirling. I always thought of trolls as the most evil, toughest, biggest monsters in the world. They had menacing tusks, crude weapons, they loved sacrifices and voodoo magic. Now there were beings who were even worse than them? How could this be? I finished cleaning up dinner and went off to bed. As I was going to sleep, I saw my father staring at my mother's picture. I had never met her, and my only memories of her were from her lone picture in our cottage. This accompanied with my father's stories about her, of course. Her father was a descendant of one of the heroes who fought in the war against the trolls, and he had often told stories to my father when they were newlywed. As I drifted off to sleep, I remembered what the trolls looked like, and I tried to imagine what the orcs might look like. Trolls were tall and slim, ranged from green to blue-colored skin, very tall with menacing tusks, but slim in figure. The females looked like males, with more hair on their head. Maybe the orcs would be tall too, but they would be gigantic, with blood popping out of their eyes, hair covering their entire body, stench that went for miles. They might eat their own fingers and other body parts if they couldn't find food. I wondered if they would just use body parts of their victims for weapons instead of metal. Would they come here? When would they come here?
Chapter 3. Our First Orc.
The Stormwind children were a bit different than us, but they were still humans. It didn't take long for them to integrate into our community. Some were kept beyond the palace's walls, and there was a rumor of another prince. None of us children had ever met him. When school began again in the fall,
Those children in the palace got education with the kings and the queens and the nobles' children. We didn't really have our first interaction with any of the Stormwind children until we all rushed towards the schoolhouse on the first day of school. Several of them made their way into our classes, and the rest were met on the playground. They told of towering gray walls, a moat surrounded by water, similar to the one that surrounded Lordaeron. Yet the city was different. It had a harbor leading to great seas and oceans, not just a small lake like here in Lordaeron. We were still proud of our lakes and wanted to show them to the children of Stormwind after school. Well, most of us, that is. Electra didn't like the newcomers from Stormwind. She was upset that many of them were talking to Swain, whom she had grown close to since the day he had stayed with her in the sewers. She also detested the way they reveled in talking about their old city.
If it was so great, then why was it so easily destroyed?
She would ask them and then cackle with glee. Some others joined her rhetoric as time passed, but Swain and I weren't among them. We took a few of the children around and showed them a small lake near my home, called Brightwater Lake. We went there with them after school, walked around the lake, skipped some stones. Then we made our way out on the logs as far as we could. A few of us took our shoes and socks off, rolled up our pants, and waded out into the lake. The time passed so quickly, and dusk was rolling in before we knew it. Reluctantly, we decided that it was time to head home. Electra and her band of anti-Stormwind-minded children began to try to stir up trouble around the playground. One day, they opened up the recess with,
"Our prince is very handsome, tall for his age, blonde hair and blue eyes, not like the evil dark-haired Stormwind prince."
Electra's mouth opened wide and she leaned back her head, letting out a roar of laughter.
"His eyes are so dark. Maybe he's really a devil,"
continued another.
"He cries a lot, I bet. If he has the same droop in his eyes that most of the Stormwind children have."
Both Stormwind children and Lordaeron children gathered around. One child stepped forward. He was bigger than Electra and walked right up to her, his eyes narrowing.
"Don't talk about our prince. He might actually rule your kingdom one day."
It was the wrong thing to say to the daughter of a hardcore Lordaeronian. Her pupils swelled and a look of concern came across the boy's face. But he continued to smile, assured that she was a girl, so nothing would happen. To his surprise, as he glanced back towards her, he didn't see her but the end of her fist, the knuckles blocking his view of her. He fell backwards and she jumped on top of him. I rushed forward to try to get her off of him, as the other Lordaeronian children rushed forward to kick him. Others joined in to try to stop the violence, grabbing attackers around the waist, dragging them back, latching onto arms and wrists, trying to control them. The bell began to ring. Half the attackers headed back to class. This made it easier to break up the fight. The Stormwind boy dusted himself off and ignored me when I asked him if he was fine. As the months passed, I saw an even more drastic change in Electra. More dust-ups like this happened from time to time. She was no longer as girlish as before, wearing pants, keeping her hair unkempt, and she wore leather tunics instead of a corset. Fights were routine. She snapped when I asked questions or said things that she thought were unreasonable. This ranged from asking for a pencil or an eraser in class to speaking fondly of the Stormwind children or prince. She was blunt, and her voice didn't waver or hit a high, uncomfortable pitch when she spoke. I welcomed her new personality. It was much more interesting than what I had experienced with her in her younger years where she had been timid and detested adventure. I didn't really like her distaste for the children from Stormwind, but everyone has their flaws. Unlike the other girl, she liked to build things, play with weapons, and go into the woods exploring with Swain and I. My conversation with Arthas about being his main explorer hadn't escaped my memory, and I ventured further and further into the woods. The more we explored, the more I felt a connection with Arthas, even though I hadn't seen him for quite a long time. One day we were exploring as usual, Swain, Electra, and I. We went the usual route, through the woods, up a ravine, crossing and climbing several rocky hills, and then we came upon a stream. We had never crossed the stream. It was wide and had rapids. Today I decided we would try to find a way across. We walked along the stream for a while, but found no place to cross. Electra suggested that we build a raft or a bridge. Thus we started. We found rocks and threw them into the river, piling them up. Some rocks were jagged or smooth. Others were large and bulky. Holes and gaps in the structure were filled with smaller rocks. At times the mounds we built collapsed, and their collapse helped us add more on top, which would spread the bridge out. This took a long time, and before we knew it, it was turning to dusk. It was enough for one day, so we headed home, careful to mark our way back so we could return. I always brought pieces of bright string and tied it along the way, so our little exploring troop could easily find our way back. We continued to work on the bridge for several weeks, and finally the rocks were high enough so that we could walk across. They still weren't that solid. They sloshed up and down as our feet traipsed across. We should add more in the future, I thought to myself. Rain and other rises in the water would eventually wash them away or cover them up. On the other side, the woods were thicker, more thorns, tangles, and vines everywhere. It was like we were in a new world. The leaves on the trees and plants were also different. They towered above, some even higher than my eyes could see. As my head tilted back, I stepped backwards and almost fell over, just trying to look up at the top of the trees. Thorns and briars snagged at my pants, sometimes my shirt too, yet I continued to push forward, as Electra and Swain followed closely behind. They gasped, and even complained that the underbrush was too thick. Regardless, I pushed forward. I wouldn't be a weak scout. Eventually we exited the thick brush and came to a clearing. There was grass and a new lake. Across the lake we saw an island. Then we froze, and our eyes widened. Before us there were bones, skulls, and more. They cluttered up along the coast. Gazing across towards the island, we saw some kind of encampment. It was hard to tell whose encampment it was. There were more bones and some animal carcasses piled up over there too. Could it be hunters, archaeologists, or maybe it was a monster? Gazing into each other's bewildered pupils, I assumed we were thinking the same thing.
Let's get out of here.
However, I had to be brave, so I motioned with my hand for Swain and Electra to follow me as we continued along the coast. That's when I found a freshly decapitated murloc's head. Murlocs were these strange fish-like, frog-like, magic-casting, and sometimes weapon-wielding monsters. They were only about as tall as an average human's knee, but they could overpower you in large numbers and could be your end. I moved down on my knee, and my fingertips grasped the moist creature's remains. His head was almost unrecognizable, smashed out were his brains and skull. His flesh spread out past his neck, empty. I was deep into my analysis when out of nowhere came a monster with a club crashing down on me. His club was covered in large spikes, and he had knocks and bumps in it. I figured they were probably the result of this monster beating a murloc's head in as I went crashing to the ground. I rolled over and jumped on my feet, and we all took off running. I didn't get a chance to see the monster too much in our haste. He had little to no armor, green skin, an atrocious face, and that club. This strange monster chased us, and as he chased us, he threw his club at Swain, connecting with his head. Our friend went limp, and he met the ground with a soft thud. We couldn't leave him or move quickly carrying him, so I decided we had to fight. We had our dull swords that we used to cut the vines and make our way through the brush. I told Electra to take Swain, and I would try to fight him off, but she laughed at me. She ducked into the brush, and the monster speared. Knocked to the ground, I gasped violently for air. He was huge, his muscles were bulging, and anger was pulsing from his gigantic veins. I felt helpless as he began taking wild swings at me with his club, and I tried to dodge them, luckily avoiding most of them. A piece of steel went right past my ear, and the monster smothered me. Electra had driven her sword through the back of his heart into the ground. Blood from the stab had splashed into my eyes. I hoped that it wasn't contagious and carrying some strange disease. It felt hot as it burned my eyes, yet, besides the blood in my eyes, I was fine, I thought. We worked to pull the monster off and then carried Swain home. As we walked, I saw there was a lot of blood on my shirt and face and neck. I checked to see if any of it was mine. After checking, it appeared that it was mostly the monster's. We had moved there at such a quick pace, but now, being slowed down, we wouldn't make it home until after dark. In the middle of the night, as the moon shone above us, we ran into dark figures, who turned out to be a search party. They were sent to find us, and now they would help us make it home safely. The tale of the monster quickly left our little mouths, and the more we told, the more they got afraid. We talked about its height, the color of its green skin, its strength, muscles, and veins. We mentioned its armor and lack of clothing. The look on their faces told us their thoughts. Gulping throats, sheepish eyes, fidgeting fingers tracing or playing with whatever they were carrying. Many of them stared at the ground by the time we were finished, deep in thoughts. Maybe they were just focused on getting back without running into more monsters. Yet I wondered if they were really just afraid of the monster. One man from the search party who was a refugee from Stormwind had a different look on his face. He was defiant. His eyebrows tightened, his eyes narrowed, his body and steps were stiff and confident. You could hear his boots pounding the ground. I walked up close to him as he led us back. He told us that we shouldn't be in this area of the woods, and that he had been scouting this area the past few weeks as well. Then he said the words that put a chill down all our spines. What we had killed wasn't just any monster. It was an orc.
Chapter 4. The Orc-Human War.
The death of the orc only foreshadowed the coming events. News reached my father and I that the orcs had launched small assaults and land grabs south as well as the islands near Lordaeron. Most of the names of the places I didn't recognize. However, that didn't keep them from being any less scary. The Stormwind leaders and King Menethil formed an alliance and began gathering other allies from the other human kingdoms. Gilneas, Kulturas, and Stromgard. Gilneas was a small kingdom west of Lordaeron. Stormgard was south and a bit farther from Lordaeron, and Kulturas was an island kingdom. Dwarves and eventually night elves also joined as their lands came under attack by the orcs. The force of monsters was becoming a threat to our entire world. The moon shone brightly one night as I lay turning back and forth in my hammock. I gazed at the table near the fire pit in the dark. My father's snores ricocheted off the walls. I took turns staring at the table and then back at the moon, fixating on the round edges of the table legs, and imagined faces of orcs and monsters replacing them. I could see them now. A shiver went up my spine. Was I psyching myself out? There was an orc's face carved into the wood. I jumped out of my hammock, and the ground vibrated. I raced out. There I lit a torch resting against the wall next to the front door. I peered back through the window and at the kitchen table. The table looked normal. Where had the orc's face gone? And what was going on? A voice shook me and I fell backwards, the torch crashing down on the dirt. It was my father, who had entered silently out of the front door that had remained open.
"Why aren't you in bed?"
he asked. I was thinking about the orcs. I came outside because I couldn't sleep. My father smiled. I had expected him to scold me or send me back to bed.
"Let's get some shoes and go for a walk,"
he said. Thus we walked in our nightgowns, nightcaps, and shoes. We walked along the fence and towards the meadows, with the lights of a town in the distance flickering.
"You don't have to fear the orcs,"
he finally said.
"A small army has been dispatched to counterattack them."
I didn't say anything.
"Mr. Arthas has joined them. There is nothing to fear. They can be taken care of like any other enemy."
I still didn't respond, so my father stopped walking.
You know Swain's father?
Yes. I didn't know he could fight.
I wasn't convinced about him being important to the fight.
Anyone can fight when they are called upon to do so. They just need a good reason.
Why aren't you joining?
I asked. My father told me that I was too young to tend to the stables alone. Swain's family lived in Stratholme, and anyone could run their shop, even a teenager. His father also did have military experience, and there were many houses near Swain's, so in the event he struggled, somebody could help him. I met Swain from time to time after that night. Swain told me that he had taken over his father's job as a seller, so that's why he hadn't been in school. His father sent him letters often, and he had sent good tidings of victory, that he thought the war in Lordaeron would soon be over. Many of the areas in Lordaeron had been retaken, and it wouldn't be long before we were pushing in on Stormwind and helping our guests take their city back. I met Swain often afterwards, visiting his shop after school. He showed me around Stratholme. It was a lot more interesting than being on the farm and working as a stable hand. Stratholme was large, with many streets, shops, houses, and even a grand bazaar. We went for a walk one day past the guards onto the bridge, overlooking a moat. The next morning I was awoken before school with my father shaking me. His words spewed out quickly, but they were hard to track. Some traitors within the human kingdom had helped orcs sneak deep into Lordaeron, and they were marching towards the palace was the main thing that I gathered. We grabbed things we thought we would need, some clothes, food, and water. Then we got the horses out of the stable and hurried them towards the palace. Many other citizens from farms were there at the gate, urgently being escorted in by the guards. The gate slammed shut, and many of the people stayed near the gate, tightly gripping their belongings. Quivering lips, uneasy eyes, and silence revealed their anticipation. Some guards came and urged us to go further into the holds. When we moved along the roads deeper into the palace stronghold as the guard had suggested, an older man a few steps behind me started muttering.
"Those Alterac bastards, just let them through, huh? If we get out of this alive, I hope our king lays waste to that petty little mountain."
Another answered,
"If he doesn't, then we'll do it ourselves."
I arrived at the campfire circle with my father and Swain. My father chimed in about the same topic the older man had been discussing.
Alterac Mountain is an area far from here. They control a pass, which they allowed the orcs to pass through freely. Whether they did it for their own lives or out of spite, they will pay for it one day. What a tragic mistake.
My eyes moved back up towards the guards on the wall, who were standing firm, yet at the same time they looked uneasy. They either paced without reason to pace, or fidgeted with their weapons, switching them from one hand to another. Archers counted and recounted their arrows, or stroked the feathers on the end of them. The sound of drums and trampling of thousands of feet rumbled the ground and shook the air as the orcs approached the palace. The siege began. Gunfire rocked out, arrows filled the skies, and wounded were rushed into the lower levels of buildings. I wondered what Arthas was doing. Swain assumed that he was locked away in the palace tower with the king and the queen. Days turned into nights, and nights turned into days, as the battle raged on. One night I was sitting around a fire as others were drifting off to sleep. Swain was snoring loudly into the night. I couldn't sleep, so I sat up, looking at the fire burning. The smoke swirled high into the sky. The fires rippled and whirled around. My gaze followed the smoke to the sky and started gazing at the stars. I was startled from my daydreams by a rock hitting the back of my foot. I whisked my head around and saw another person my age, whom was wearing a cloak that concealed his identity. Yet I could see his blue eyes glint by the rays of the moonlight and blonde hair sneaking out from the top of the cloak.
"You can't sleep either," he said. "I could see you from the tower's window." Let's see how close we can get to the fortress's wall. I got up and followed him. I knew who it was. We crept slowly past people sleeping, avoided guards patrolling, and we made it to the foot of the wall. There was one more guard coming. We ducked behind a large barrel, watching him pass. He stopped right near the barrel, looked right at the top of the barrel, around again, up at the sky. He began to whistle softly, then he did an about-face and made his way back to the other side of the base of the wall. We had two options: try to scale the wall, or try to sneak our way up the stairs and past more guards. Arthas urged me to go first, that he would be the lookout. I grabbed onto the large stones that made up the wall. They had deep and long edges in between them that made it easy to dig in your hands and feet as you made your way up. Eventually, I had almost made it to the top. I saw a guard facing towards me with his back. He stared deeply into the dark landscape. I checked what was happening below. I saw the guard on the ground was still patrolling the opposite way. I looked for Arthas and motioned for him to come, and then slowly slid onto the wooden area past the stone wall, still lying on my stomach as Arthas made his way up. When he reached me, I glanced back down at the guard. He was about to turn around. I grabbed Arthas's hand and ripped him up to the top of the wall. The commotion made the guard on the wall turn around. "What in the hell are you boys doing up here?"
he demanded. We gasped at an orc rogue who was lunging with his knife behind him. As he turned towards the assassin, he was stabbed into the back of his shoulder. Arthas quickly raced forward and kicked the orc in the foot to make him lose his balance partially on the wall. He dropped his knife as the guard drew his sword, but he was hit in the chest with an arrow and slumped backwards, falling on his knees onto the ground. Arthas was now also open to arrows, so I jumped in front of him and punched the assassin in the ribs as hard as I could. He reacted by reaching in pain towards his ribs, but this caused him to lose his grip on the wall. We both kicked at him as he fell. An arrow came streaking past my ear. Both Arthas and I fell to the ground. As a guard in another tower sounded the alarm, we crawled back towards the wall and jumped down. The guard who had been patrolling went racing past us, and we went sprinting the other way, back to the camp area. The battle continued for several days. One day, without reason, half the orc army left. The Stormwind commander quickly pulled the troops together, opened the gate, and charged out. They slew the rest of the orc army quite easily, without the rest of the orcs who had left.
Swain and my father discussed if it was a trap or not.
However, the other orcs never came back. The humans and the entire Alliance army went south, and in the coming weeks they achieved total victory. There was news of one last battle at a portal deep in the south, in an area I had never heard of. The orcs fought hard one last time, but they would lose, and those remaining would surrender. Those captives were ushered off to camps, and the portal was destroyed. People hoped that no other orcs would ever return, and the orcs left behind would be enslaved forever, slowly dying and paying the price for all the suffering and war they had caused.
Chapter 5. The Horde Threat.
The victories against the orcs created a new alliance between the night elves, dwarves, gnomes, and other human kingdoms. The orcs were put into internment camps. It was rumored that some of these camps were even close to the woods where Electra, Swain, and I had run into that orc. I wanted to visit them, but my father wouldn't let me. He said that the orcs were vicious beasts, but what was worse was how they were treated in those camps. The next 15 years breezed by, like a flash by a shooting star in a dark sky. I continued to work on the farm at my father's stable. Arthas went off to the magical city of Dalaran. Swain took over his father's shop in Stratholme, and all of Electra's siblings were married except for her. She took up summer jobs at different farms, including ours, as a field hand. Her father had protested against her doing such manly work, but she insisted that she wanted to do this kind of labor. It is strange how quickly time flies when you are in a routine, waking up, working all day,
eating dinner, having a small conversation before going to bed, and repeating the same thing every day for years. During breaks in the work, I visited Swain and Stratholme, and I would also see Electra when she came by our farm to do work in the fields. During the spring, when my father went to the palace, I stayed and took care of our farm stable. I was of age to do all the work myself, and remember the first spring alone. My father wrote a list of things to do, daily, weekly, and monthly. I was just passing 20 at the time, so I was a bit offended by his overbearing description of the tasks. As he rode off on the wagon, I had a calm yet anxious feeling, so I sat down outside the front door for a while, watching the clouds float by and the sun glisten down on the fields and fence posts. Everything went smoothly as I had imagined. My father was silly to doubt me, I thought to myself one day. Daily I cleaned the stable, resupplied the hay, let the horses into the field in the early morning, fed them twice a day, and monitored their water. Weekly I gave them brushings, checked their horse hooves, and did any repairs that were needed. Monthly I changed the horses' horseshoes and made sure to take each horse for a ride at least once a month as well. One morning as I opened the front stable door, my eyes grew wide and my mouth gaped open. There was a horse leg sticking out from one of the stalls. Its leg had some blood stains on it and a fresh pool of wetness below it. I raced over and wheeled around. My fears were eased, but then reawakened. There was a newborn foal sleeping close to the horse, which looked up at me, and its eyes seemed to judge me harshly. I felt ashamed for being so concerned, but now I was still worried. What should I do with the foal? I sprinted out of the stable and back to the cottage. My eyes whirled with excitement and desperation across the pages my father had left for me. There was nothing written about foals being born and what I should do. I went back to the stable and watched them for a while. The mother kept her eyes, and a stupid stare gazed on me the entire time. After a few hours I got up and fetched a broom. I worked around the newborn and its mother, replacing the hay and sweeping the stable. The afternoon quickly swept into the early evening. No idea what to do with the foal or horse had come to me yet. The moist spot was now stained onto the floor. The foal was slurping noisily, and the horse looked up at me again when I came into view. All of the horses were fed, watered, and some of them stayed in the field at night, while others came back to the stable. The stable door was left ajar, and I went back to watch the foal and its mother. Deep into the morning I watched them. The mother continued staring at me, but then finally rested her head across her legs towards her child. The foal rested its head up against its mother's large nose. I heard a rooster crowing and shook my head awake. I must have fallen asleep in the stable. My franticness awoke the mother, who then stared at me again. I stood up and made my way to the cottage for a well-deserved breakfast. There were 3 weeks left until my father would return. If I could make sure that everything was okay up to then, I would be fine. I decided to leave the foal and its mother to themselves and feed the others as if everything were normal. When my father's wagon could be heard approaching in the distance, I ran towards it like I hadn't seen him for 10 years. Words spilled out of my mouth like milk out of a fallen glass. My father caught them and laughed.
Animals have their own way of surviving without us. They should be fine,
he said as he smiled. The first time Electra came, it was a surprise. It was early fall, and the leaves of the trees changed to yellow, orange, red, and sometimes purple. Electra said that she was allowed to work labor at farms for seasonal work. She wanted to get out of her house and be more independent. All of her siblings were married, and she wasn't interested in such a life. My father gave her tasks that he used to give me, mending the fences, counting horseshoes, and sweeping. I was a professional at these tasks, so I helped her when I needed to. One day, as she was mending fences, she got a giant splinter in her hand. She came running up to me in the stable, as there was blood streaming down her hand from the vicious spike. I helped her pull it out and then bandaged it. She closed her eyes and bit her finger as I pulled it out. After it was bandaged, she rested at one of the chairs near the table in the kitchen.
"What do you think about this life?"
she asked.
"Could you see yourself here forever?"
I had never thought about it that way, and as I fumbled around with my thoughts and words escaped my mouth, it came back to me that I wanted to be an explorer before. So I had to ask myself, what was I doing now? She came and went from fall to spring and sometimes in the summer too. I settled into the tasks again without thinking about exploring for a while. The routine, the peace, was all broken one day. There were reports of orc internment camp rebellions. They had happened before, but this time many of them had escaped. They had a leader who had been a gladiator in captivity. His name was Thrall. News kept coming back and forth about the developments. The orcs had made their way to a coast and crossed the Great Sea to another continent that I didn't know much about. It was called Kalimdor. They were getting settled in and building an orcish empire. They also had many new allies that they had collected throughout their journey to Kalimdor. This struck fear in a lot of the humans in our kingdom, as well as the other races in our alliance. In a panic, our kingdom started to prepare for war. Many men and women from the ages of 18 to 30 were rushed off to various training schools. The most popular ones were the paladin and priest institutions. This was due to the fact that the orcs were extremely powerful. Different types of magic had developed in the last 20 years too. Only being a good shot with a bow or a good fighter with a sword and shield was no longer good enough. The humans of Stormwind had mastered the art of dark warlock magic, practiced by the orcs, and the art of wizardry taught to them by the elves. They were able to cast large fireballs, freeze things into ice, and more. Being a paladin or priest meant that you had the protection of the lights. It all came back to me now. The days of being a child at the palace, when the guard had told me about being a paladin. Arthas had also become a paladin. Before he went off to Dalaran, that is. Now I remembered. I rushed off to paladin school and was quickly signed up. They wondered what a stable hand could do. However, the recruitment officer told me that he could sense a bit of holiness from within me already. I flipped through recruitment pages that showed some of the greatest paladins. There was Uther. He was the most famous paladin and leader of the Silver Hands. There was another paladin, Muradin Bronzebeard. He was a dwarf, and his main prestige had been his mentoring of Prince Arthas. There was one last paladin. He was called Tyrion Fordreen. He had been stripped of his paladin powers because he tried to save an orc whom had saved his life. The pamphlet went to say nobody can strip anyone of the lights. And this paladin, though he was no longer in the Silverhand ranks, would always be able to use the powers of the light. It sounded great. An eternity with a protective force behind you. Electra tried to join the paladin school with me. We went together on the same day. I walked up to the recruitment officer, who was a different one than the first one I had met, and he asked me a couple of questions. He had me solve a few puzzles and try to memorize prayers to check my basic ability. He grunted, seemingly not very impressed, but said I had potential, just like the first recruitment officer had said. He gave me a few books and sent me off to meet another man. On the way there, I looked back to watch how Electra had fared. It wasn't common for women to join the fighting as paladins or warriors, and the paladins had more of a military field than priesthood. Most of the girls were sent to the priest school or kept at home by their parents. I watched as their conversation didn't look to be doing well. Electra's temper flared. I could hear her shouting, but I couldn't understand the words she was saying. The recruitment officer tried to smirk and remain calm, but eventually he started yelling too. Another paladin came out. He was very tall with large shoulder pads and graying hair. He spoke slowly and gestured in a smooth fashion. It only took a few moments before he managed to calm Electra down, and she ended up coming with me. We both walked together, but her eyes remained fixated on the ground, and her lips were flat as the ground she was staring at. We made it to our quarters and went inside, where we had to part ways. The rooms were dusty in the beginning, with dirty linens, and 6 men or 6 women to each room. One of the first tasks was to shower, clean the linens, and tidy the rooms. Half of our training was cleaning.
The commanders and lieutenants, also the sergeants, constantly told us that the biggest challenge of being a good warrior or paladin was patience and discipline. Perfect hesitation and anticipation could go a long way, they said. We woke up early in the morning. That's when we had high-intensity physical training. We had challenges, mock battles, and fights. At night was when we had rigorous studying and practicing of holy spells and protections. Our leaders told us that the light spells were the most powerful in the deepest, darkest moments of the night. One day we would be in a pit of darkness, with no hope, yet the light would remain strong and lead us to victory. I noticed that Electra excelled at weapon training, physical education, and the mock battles, but struggled at night with the lights. She complained that she was tired and just wanted to sleep. The words from the holy books put her to sleep and that she was already about to pass out from fatigue. One night I noticed that she didn't attend the light training. Then the next night, and the next, and the night after that, she was also nowhere to be found. She was also absent in the mock battles and the weapons training. I hadn't noticed that on the other days, as I was too focused on my position in the battle. I started to think a lot about it. But then, as the routine of the training took over, it slipped from my mind. Many days had passed with the training intensifying, but then we started to get some freedom. There was a short time in the late morning when we were allowed to do what we wanted. One morning I was using this time to go for a walk. I noticed some different buildings in the distance from the paladin training area. Once down there I saw shields, swords, and other weapons. Men and women in the courtyard jousting and dueling. Then a girl with a helmet on spoke to me.
Did you come here to show off the light?
What? She took off her helmet and revealed that she was Electra. She seemed to be upset at me, but I didn't know why. I haven't seen you for quite some time. Is this where you have been?
Of course this is where I've been, because I got kicked out of the paladin school.
I found out that she was in a warrior school now, and her family was concerned about her protection against the orcs. But this was the next best thing. For some reason, her inability to wield the light led to her being released from the paladin training. I was at a loss for words at that moment. How could you explain to an angry and disappointed person that it shouldn't matter? I knew whatever I said wouldn't please her, but I tried anyway. We are both soldiers, and we fight for Lordaeron. I fight as a paladin, and you as a warrior. This shouldn't keep us from being friends. Her head nodded, but her eyes remained unconvinced. When I left, I promised that I would come to visit her from time to time. I reached the road and turned back to watch, and she was dueling another warrior. In a matter of seconds, steel clashed, and hilts slammed into hilts, blocked blades. The commotion was hard to follow, but then the other warrior lay on the ground looking up at her. She put her blade to his throat and then looked up at the road towards me. I wondered how much rage she was storing inside and whom she was really angry at. Was she angry at the lights? Perhaps she was still upset at the paladin trainers. Was it that she held a grudge against Uther, the head of the paladins, for kicking her out? Or was it me?
Chapter 6. The Scourge.
With the training intensifying, the moment with Electra seeped deeper into my non-conscious memory. The most intense moment was our final challenge. We would duel the Master Paladins one-on-one. The first candidate stepped up. I could see his blade move back and forth in its sheath. His hand must have been quivering for it to shake that much. There was a countdown. 3, 2, 1. The Paladin Master's hand shot from side to side. Giant yellow beaming wings appeared out of his back. His hands then ripped out his sword and he charged at the cadet. The cadet tried to swing his sword, and the blades slammed into each other, ripping one hand off his own sword and swinging his arm in a sharp undercutting motion. The Paladin Master smashed his fist into the bottom of the cadet's jaw. The cadet was immobilized for several seconds, looking at the ground like a woozy drunkard. Paladin Master waited, then gripped both of his hands on his sword and slammed it into the cadet's helmet with the flat side of his sword.
The cadet went falling into the ground.
"Where's your light?"
screamed the paladin master. The cadet did not move for a few moments, and the master stood looking at him.
"You have nothing. No defensives, no light, no aggression. Next,"
came out of his mouth, returning his gaze towards the rest of us. I stepped forward. The sky was the limit now. Coming to a battle after a performance like that, there was almost no way you could do worse than the first candidate had done. It was the perfect opportunity to do well. It started the same, a charge, an uppercut, but then I knew what was coming. I was dazed whilst still remembering what had happened after the uppercut. I ducked. His sword went zooming over my head. It was like a summer breeze whipping by. I felt helpless, but I knew I had to do something fast. I remembered all the spells we had worked on at night, and I only began channeling them. As he kicked and slammed his sword into different parts of metal on me, I continued to channel the lights.
"You cannot win if all you do is heal your wounds,"
the paladin master barked. I knew he was right, but I couldn't find an opening. That is when I saw in between his leg armor and his chest armor, there was a slim opening. You could see some cloth or tailored shirt underneath. Right after my next healing light finished channeling, I swung my foot as hard as I could and aimed right at that opening. The master stumbled backward and laughed, but that was the last thing I remembered, as the next thing I knew I was opening my eyes and staring up at him. Colors were still mixing together as I felt my head. My helmet was gone. When I could finally see clearly again, I found it behind me.
"Not bad,"
the paladin master said.
"Who's next?"
Those who did well were allowed a week-long break until they would get their first assignment, while others who completely failed or didn't perform well enough were kept in the training grounds. They would continue to train while the others got to head home and then out to different posts and appointments. At home, my father welcomed me. It was nice to be back home on the farm. However, that evening my father gave me grave news. There had been a messenger who called himself a prophet who had come to the king of Lordaeron. He had a message that a great darkness was coming and that we needed to flee to the other continent, Kalimdor, where the orcs were. The king had scoffed at the prophet and almost insinuated that he was a madman.
"We will stay here and defend our kingdom,"
were his words. My father continued.
"There have been reports of a strange plague in the north. It decays the skin, it rots the brain. When you die, you live again. However, you live as some kind of brainless creature, and you have no free will, serving dark masters instead."
My eyes widened as my father continued to talk. The last thing he told me was that there was a small party going north to investigate in the morning, and that since I was such a great explorer and a scout, that he thought I should help them. With the early morning coming, I tried to sleep a bit earlier than normal. As I lay in my bed and closed my eyes, sleep did not come. My mind was clouded with thoughts of the plague, the creatures. As my thoughts continued to wander, it kept me up. I began to count down the minutes I had left and how many hours of sleep I would get, which also didn't help me get to sleep. My father shaking my shoulder woke me the next morning. He would be doing his normal stable work, but I had to head out and meet the scouting party. I approached a group of men waiting at the gates of Stratholme. There were 14 of them. Most of them wore leather armor, cloaks, and other light gear. They were strung with crossbows on their backs, swords and daggers strapped to their belts, and others carrying maces. I hadn't even thought to bring a weapon, and I was in normal traveling clothes. To my surprise, Swain was there. I hadn't seen him since I left for the Paladin training school. I moved at a fast pace to his side and we embraced. We went over the usual remarks of what we had been doing since we had last seen each other. Most of the other men were quiet. They scowled at us for talking, so after a few moments we were quiet too. It appeared to be a much more serious expedition than I had imagined. The group circled around, and the leader was a retired commander who now resided in Stratholme. His eyes fixed on me. He told me the details of the area where we were heading and asked me to lead.
We would be going on foot, and we trekked through mostly light woodland. There were large rocks from time to time, and many mushrooms of all sizes and bloom. The colors changed as we went deeper into the woods, colors I had never seen before, and they dripped with other strange colors as well.
"What happened to the trees?"
asked one of the soldiers. The commander stopped, and we followed suit. I turned around.
"Perhaps it has something to do with the plague,"
the commander said. We pressed on. Our mission had us out after dark. We continued deep into the night, searching. Our party stopped when we saw smoke coming from a campfire. Upon reaching the campfire, we stayed in the woods and gazed at the opening. It was not a campfire of normal people, not a campfire of normal activities or objects. There was a cauldron burning with body parts in it, and dead creatures surrounded it. Brainless monstrosities staggered in circles around the camp. The creature's flesh oozed with a mix of blood, different colors, and textures of goo and pus. They uttered strange sounds that made chills radiate up and down my spine. Other beings in the camp wandered about, without a sense of purpose. There was a man in a hood, with his back towards us. He had old worn boots that crept out below his robe and cloak. All of his garments were purple and black. The hood was all black. It went past his lower neck and hung around his shoulders. We decided that their numbers were too great and retreated. On our way back, we were ambushed. There had been no conversation, only hurried walking. A ghoul jumped out and was cut down. Then more came. They ripped and clawed at flesh, while more jumped from trees and other parts of the darkness. The second wave sliced and ripped at throats and wrists. Everyone was taken down as fast as a new wave of ghouls came, but I managed to escape, diving into the bushes. One undead minion came after me, and I led him down towards a river, where I grabbed a rock and waited for it. Jumping out at the undead beast, I used the rock and smashed its head repeatedly until there was nothing but goo and blood rushing out. I snuck back as quickly as I could, and I came upon the other dead creatures now carrying the bodies of my fallen comrades and friend. I followed them back to the camp with the man in the hood. They piled the bodies near the cauldron. Some of the bodies were thrown into the cauldron, while some of the creatures started gnawing on the remaining bodies. One took a giant bite out of the man's leg, like a boy taking a bite out of an apple. The small chunk inside its mouth made an unbearable squishing sound as blood came dripping and then flowing down the ghoul's furry cheeks. The leg now had a wide gap of open flesh that also had blood oozing down its flesh. As the creature munched hungrily, the hooded man's fists clenched and his body tensed all over. He kicked one ghoul in the head and it fell to the ground. The ghoul's brain had been broken from the kick, and it lay motionless. As his laugh resonated and disgusted me, the other creatures began to kick the fallen one.
So easily replaceable. Get away from the corpses, fools!
He pulled out a wand and sent rays of blue and purple colored magic at the other scourge, and they went flying. They hopped and yelped in torment, but they were still alive. Rays came out of the hooded man's fingertips, this time instead of the wand. They were a white coloration and were directed at the remaining bodies. Cracking sounds emitted, and then he stopped. All the bodies now were fried and turned to liquid that seeped into the ground. The ground shook a little, and new dead creatures came out of the ground. Swain was a zombie. I couldn't believe my eyes, but I didn't have time to be frozen with fear or to even mourn the loss of my friend. I ran away as fast as my feet could carry me, ashamed that I had left him behind and helpless that I could do nothing to stop them. If they were chasing me, I couldn't hear them, as my heartbeat and footsteps were grounding out any other sound I tried to hear at that moment. All I saw was mostly darkness, the ever so often shape of a tree or branch tripping and rolling over roots and rocks. My lungs were about to explode. My shin's muscles were twisting and grasping at my bones, and I stopped for a moment. I held my breath and tried to slow my heartbeat to listen. There was no sound, only silence. The moonlight dropped down below on me when I exited part of the trees. It was a ridge overlooking the sea. Where was I? I descended down the cliffs on the rocks to find a spot where the scourge wouldn't find me, if they were still looking. There was a small crevice below the cliff. There I rested for the night. I had just enough space to lie down with my legs leaning upwards and several rocks to the side to save a fall. As I closed my eyes and thought about sleeping, I only hoped that the next morning I would wake up alive.
Chapter 7. The Culling of Stratholme.
The sunlight pierced through my eyes. They opened reluctantly. Where was I? I looked down and my heart hit an all-out sprint. I was high above the water. Then I hit my head. There was a cliff above me. I grasped the rocks and moved from knob to knob until my hands were gripped on the edge and my legs dangling high above the water, with gravity clinging to them and waiting for my hands to give way. I launched myself forward and landed on my back on top of the cliff, staring at the sky. There was no time to ponder all that had happened, but the moment still seeped in. I headed back towards Stratholme. It took me several days to make it back, different paces of running, jogging, and walking, then getting worried again and running out of energy and having to slow or walk again. I arrived on the outskirts of Stratholme. We were expected to come back as it was only supposed to be an overnight excursion. I decided against going into the city. I didn't want to make a scene or have to tell Swain's parents about what had happened, so I stayed on the outskirts and slowly made my way around the city. Stratholme was a beautiful city from afar. White brick walls that surrounded it, a moat that enclosed it, and a bridge that led up to the entrances to the main gates from each side. Above the walls you could see the taller buildings, the keep, a small cathedral in the distance. Even being on the outskirts, it was still a welcoming sight to see after being in the wild for a night. It was all in the background. As I was exiting the outskirts, I continued to walk back towards my father's farm. However, I ran into a carriage, and the man recognized me. He was one of my fellow paladins. Unfortunately, I didn't remember his name. I called him Fellow Brother of the Light, and he responded in the same way. He asked where I was going, and I told him, towards the Lordaeron Palace, and then further to my father's farm. He said he could take me as far as the palace, and then he would be heading towards Brill. We chatted with small talk for most of the trip, and then I eventually had to tell him the truth of what I had been doing the last few days. He urged me not to spend too much time at the farm, and to head back to the training grounds early and report what I had seen to the High Paladins. The rest of the ride was spent in solemn silence, no doubt because of my news. When I arrived home it was late evening, and only a little light remained from the sunset. The smell of dinner overwhelmed the house. My father had been cooking boar stew. He asked me to take a seat. He was curious about how the expedition had gone. I told him I would explain everything after we finished eating. There was no reason to ruin our appetite. We sat silently, and when we had finished, he didn't waste any time in asking his question again.
How was the expedition?
He asked one more time. I was forced to explain how I was the only one who had survived and how the others that he knew were dead. As I described the creatures, my father stood up and paced around the room. It was bad. He told me I had to head back to the paladin quarters at first dawn. This was an emergency. I woke up a little before dawn and stepped outside. It was still dark, but there was some light starting to appear on the horizon. It soon turned into pink and light orange colors. My father startled me as he came around the corner of the cottage. I shouldn't have been surprised, because he was in the stable at this hour every morning, but I was on edge. He told me that he had saddled a horse, and after breakfast it was ready to leave with me. Upon arrival at the paladin headquarters, I requested an urgent meeting with Uther. He was the most senior paladin, and the leader of the Silver Hands. The other paladins told me that Uther was not there, that he and most of the paladins who had come back had gone on an emergency mission. That had been several days prior. There had been some grain that had been laced with a plague that turned humans into undead creatures. Prince Arthas had traced the source and gone on several missions, first to Andorral and later to Hearthglen. Alarmed that he was going alone, Uther and many of the Silverhand members had pursued him and headed to Hearthglen. I asked if I should go help as well, and was told that he could use all the men he could get. I grabbed my armor, weapons, and I mounted a new horse. There was no time to waste. I dug my boots in tight and whipped the reins up and down. The horse's hooves couldn't pound any faster as we raced toward Hearthglen. The outer city was in flames, and there were undead corpses everywhere I looked. I reached the Silver Hand, and there was Prince Arthas and a woman. The woman turned out to be a mage who practiced magic. Arthas and her had been trapped and needed to be saved by the Silver Hands. Fortunately, all the undead had been slain. Uther turned with the Silver Hand to go. Arthas told him that he and all the Silver Hands should meet him at the gates of Stratholme the following day. All of the Silver Hand, mercenary paladins, and paladins in training were summoned to the outskirts of Stratholme. He stood overlooking Stratholme as I arrived. Then I saw Electra, and I moved near her and asked if she knew what was going on. She said no, and asked me how I was doing. She didn't seem angry as before. Our greetings and questions were inferior to our surroundings. Stratholme City's towers stood high above as they always did. Questions about the reason for the meeting also loomed. Some more soldiers arrived, and then Arthas started off things with a speech. He said the grain in Stratholme had been plagued, just like Hearthglen. Soon the people would all be zombies, undead. We would have to kill them as undead, so we should purge the city now to save them from their suffering. Arthas and Uther began arguing. Arthas had made his plan to kill all the citizens in Stratholme known, which Uther and the mage woman strongly disagreed with. Stratholme was close to our stable and where Swain's family lived, so I was alarmed and immediately concerned. Arthas's reasoning was that the grain had been laced with the plague, and everyone in Stratholme was infected and soon would be undead and part of the scourge. Of course it sounded fair. It also sounded logical, but killing them didn't seem right. Prince Arthas's temper flared without warning. He stripped Uther of his command and disabled the Silver Hand. Only his words were needed and it was done. Arthas followed that by giving an ultimatum: join him or leave with Uther. His words were, "Join me or get out of my sight." I couldn't believe I would have to make this type of decision one day. I had never been prepared for this. Stand by a childhood friend and his family, or follow the well-loved prince. I had always idolized him, looked up to him. I had enjoyed every moment with him and wanted to please him. However, I couldn't slay innocent people. I would much rather slay the zombies who I wouldn't recognize, who wouldn't scream as they died, or look betrayed as they were unexpectedly cut down. I looked at Electra, and she stepped back, looking back at me, and then giving a cold look at Uther. I didn't move. All the memories I had with Swain, his family, and walking around Stratholme flashed and raced before my eyes. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I turned around and walked away, with many other paladins who did the same.
Chapter 8. Arthas's Crusade.
We were barely past the gate when Arthas walked up to the first group of citizens and cut them down. The citizens didn't foresee their demise coming. They never expected their beloved and handsome prince to turn on them. It wasn't a betrayal in our eyes. It was only a sacrifice and a favor. There was a strange noise. The ground shook and a dreadlord appeared. He was massive. Not only did he tower above us, but he also had gigantic muscles, biceps bigger than both Arthas and I put together. His body was dark-colored. He had horns and a sinister face that only a mother could love. Long claws bigger than our swords pierced out of the end of his fingers. Large hooves held his body up. Noise ricocheted against the walls of his throat as wicked laughter came out. His voice boomed in the same way. He laughed at Arthas and mocked him.
You are too late.
He cackled. At the snap of his long fingers, all of the citizens turned into zombies, and he vanished into thin air. I unsheathed my sword and wasn't reluctant to take the undead out. I hated those stupid paladins who said I wasn't good enough to be part of their order. The light was stupid anyway. I was more than happy to be officially done with Uther and follow Arthas. I was glad he got rid of the silver hand, too. We went from street to street chopping and cutting citizens who were now zombies down. Our feet clanked on the stones of the rows as our group purged the town market and main square and other places, meticulously searching and quarantining every last corner of the city. The quest to cleanse the city was met by hooded necromancers and other large monstrosities. Our swords entered their hearts one by one, and Arthas led us to a tavern that had a secret passage to another section of the city. It was dark and abandoned, strewn with spider webs and littered with old barrel caskets, empty bottles, and ruined food. We exited out of a door and came to another street. The demons and undead were on the run, and now setting fire to the remaining parts of the city. As we arrived at the last part of the city, there was the Dreadlord waiting. His name was Mal'Ganis. He was the one we had also met at the entrance of Stratholme. All of the soldiers' eyes were on Arthas, weapons out and ready. We didn't have to wait long. Arthas sprinted forward. The rest of us followed. Arthas swung his golden mace and smashed at the Dreadlord's armor, at his knees, at his toes, and against the bones and the muscles of his feet. Archers flung arrows toward his face and eyes. Swords and axes cut and sliced. Mal'Ganis cast dark magic, and it brought many men to their knees. Priests and paladins worked hard to refresh those out of energy or life. The Dreadlord was now bloody. He limped, but he would not be beaten. To our amazement, he channeled a new spell, a large purple barrier. Now all attacks were harmless. He taunted Arthas to follow him to a place called Northrend. He said that Arthas would meet his destiny there. Arthas didn't wait long. By the next morning, we had all boarded ships and headed toward the northern island. Not much was loaded onto the ship. A couple of weeks' supply of food, ammunition for the ship's cannons, and for the archers and hunters' bows and guns. The rest was up to the warriors, who brought only melee weapons and armor. It looked like Arthas didn't expect this crusade to last long. The ship ride itself took forever, but we knew when we were close. You could feel the chill no matter where you were on the ship. The wooden and iron sides of the vessel glided and cracked through ice. The beach welcomed us from afar. Shortly after landing, we slew all the undead we came across. Next, the lesser-ranked soldiers and workers set up outposts and began building a camp on the beach, while Arthas left with a few higher-ranking officers and his mentor, Muradin Bronzebeard, to scout and find the Dreadlord. A few days later, Arthas came back alone. He had a new sword. Where was his trusty mace? I asked myself. The sword was large with a bluish haze around it. It looked very sinister. Where did he get this blade? My thoughts were interrupted as he rounded us up. He told us that he found the whereabouts of the Dreadlord Mal'Ganis. All of the soldiers took up arms and followed Arthas. We cornered the Dreadlord, and this time, he had no surprise for us. The fight went exactly as it had in Stratholme, except this time he actually died. As he died, he told Arthas that it was all part of the plan. I expected to see a new look or sense a different feeling from Arthas, but there was nothing. He was listening to something. He ordered us back to the beach, and we didn't see him for a long while. The time dragged on forever, as we built docks, small buildings, and other structures. Horsemen and footmen patrolled. Workers continued laboring. hammering out mistakes and repairing damaged features. We continued toiling for what felt like days, and we made a lot of progress. It started to look like an actual coastal town. I was mainly a guard and patrolled around. I liked to take breaks from time to time and go to a secluded part of the beach and make my way out to the end of the rocks. I would look across the water and wonder what was happening back in our homeland. How was Lordaeron, my family, Tanyan? When was our campaign going to be over? And when were we going to go home? I skipped rocks. I stared at the slowly moving clouds. I watched their shapes. They seemed to swirl and dance here more so than in Lordaeron. The crash of the waves would interrupt my gaze. I would watch them in the distance, and the ones crashing violently against the rocks. Sometimes you could see fish bobbing and weaving in pools close to the rocks. I thought about catching them, but I wasn't hungry. That was the weirdest thing. I was never hungry. They say that after 4 days of starving, you lose your desire for food, and you stop desiring it. Had it really been 4 days? When was the last time I had eaten? I couldn't remember. Maybe I should ask someone, I pondered to myself. Night was coming, though. Thinking about sleep made me forget about if I was starving or not. I made my way from the rocks toward the beach. It was my turn to take over the post, to let the other guard get some sleep. The strange thing is that I also couldn't remember the last time I had slept. Maybe that's why I was so tired.
Chapter 9. Becoming a Death Knight.
The sun came up and went down. The time was passing, but I didn't know how much time had passed. The horizon was always grim-looking. It was hard to tell what time of the year it was. It was always winter. The sea was dark, the clouds were dark, and they reflected back down into the water dark. I hadn't seen the sun come out from behind the clouds for ages, yet each day I did the same thing. Each time I replaced a guard, there must have been a day passing. There was no message from Arthas. There was no messenger sent by him. The wind whispered and screamed. There was nowhere to hide on this desolate beach. One day, I stood at my post on duty, my legs stiffened, arms at my sides, and my weapon in its sheath. I would take a walk about 30 meters to the left and come back, do the same to the right. Back to the standing spot I went, where I spent most of my time during guard duty. The horizon slipped slightly above the edge of the water in the distance. Clouds choked and held the sky, and the water was smooth close to the line that met it. The sounds of shouts widened my eyes, and my head turned toward the left. I was on the farthest edge away from the newly created town, and across from the town was where the ships were docked. Men of all ranks were running towards the bank. They were pointing at ships. I gazed out. Smoke rose and joined the clouds and choking the sky. Soon flames danced and sails collapsed. The useless wooden frames sat on the water, burning for hours until their flames died. What remained of the frames of the ships sat as embers until they slowly slid under the sea. There stood an old man looking at a parchment.
We were told to go home, but now the ships are burning. We were told to go home, but now the ships are burning.
He kept repeating to himself. Over and over like a madman, he muttered. I turned back to my post. It was now evident that we were never going home. Arthas was nowhere to be found. The rest of the soldiers and workers slowly got back into their routines, patrolling, guarding, building, and swapping in and out of shifts. A few shifts later, I was staring out into the sea. A large man with grotesque armor and no helmet came up to me. I thought that I recognized him. His hair was white, his face light-skinned, and somewhere in between purple and gray. He had startled me as I turned around. Taking a few seconds to recognize him, it was Arthas. Where was his blonde hair, his peachy skin? What had happened to him?
I have news for you.
News?
Yes, your father is dead.
It was sudden. Wetness began to build up in my eyes. How had my father died? And why Arthas would suddenly appear just to tell me about it? I was even more shaken by what he said next. He asked if I wanted to see my father again. I told him I would do anything to speak to him. He beckoned me to follow him. I trailed after him down the beach where we came upon a corpse. I recognized it as my father, and went down to comfort him. Arthas laughed. He snickered and cackled. To my shock and horror, there came white-like magic out of Arthas' sword into my father's body. All I could do was stare, and I begged Arthas to stop, but he didn't. My father's body changed colors. From corpse white, there came blue and purple veins and lines that pulsed in and out of his skin. His body tensed and shook. His hair blew in the breeze created by the magical spell that Arthas was casting. Then my father's eyes opened. They were blue that glowed like a lighthouse light along a coast in the dark. He sat up. He stood up, and the muscles in my face quenched and squealed. And I wanted to run, but I couldn't run from my own father. I couldn't shriek and scream at a family member's presence, or new physical appearance. My mind twisted and torqued with scenarios and ideas, but there was no resolution. How had he even arrived here and died in the first place? I didn't remember him coming with us. Arthas spoke to me, awakening me from my trance-like state.
You want to join him?
What? You damned monster! I'm not dead! What have you done to my father?
Arthas laughed again, as my father stood blankly yet loyally by Arthas' side. He pushed his sword through my body, and I felt nothing.
You seem very transparent.
Then, without my will, Arthas cast the same spell on me. White and blue light from his sword came crashing into my body. I felt like I wanted to scream, but my tongue wouldn't work. Fingers and limbs and all my features lost their control. All I could hear was Arthas' voice. But was it Arthas? Who was it?
Bow to your master. You followed me in life. Now follow me in death and live forever. Bow to your master. Bow to your king. You will follow my every command. You are mine.
The words racing through my head, the motions and waves slashed into my body. It was burning torture. Arthas' words repeated themselves over and over in my head. Even as I could see his lips moving, and it didn't sound like him, it had to be him. In my head, he was changed. Something had happened to him. But what? It was hard for my brain to focus as it moved back and forth from the painful transformation of his blade magic and the words repeating over and over that he was my master. Then it was all over. It was weird that on that day I no longer thought for myself. I didn't even stop to search for words or thoughts. I no longer contemplated who Arthas was or what had happened. Thoughts entered my brain automatically. Walk forward. Join your father. Follow us back to Lordaeron. We have a job to do. We must crown a new king. We must raise him a steed. We must kill anyone in our path. The thought stopped for a moment and I walked and stood next to my father. Both of our blue eyes were now glowing brightly, beautifully. We followed Arthas. We followed our new king. To Lordaeron. To the death.
Chapter 10. Raising Invincible.
Thoughts of my own no longer entered my mind, but the experiences still remain in my memory. We traveled by boat. We being Arthas, my father, and myself. He was no longer Arthas. He was the Lich King. He was now my new master, and his will entered my mind, and it was done. It was as if I were some kind of puppet in a show, Someone controlled me. They swung my sword, and they killed their enemies. They forced me to go on missions, to open doors, to pick up items, to do anything their heart desired. As the boat slid into shallower waters, you could see the ground below the sea. The rugged coastline had only one beach. There were small wooden huts and no other sign of life besides the wild animals. The same creatures I had killed when I was younger, with D'Artagnan and Swain, were patrolling the beach, and some were standing inside the huts. These short, bright-colored monsters brought back memories. That was the day we had run into the orc. On this day, we waded to shore from the boat. We killed the monsters on our way up a hill. The sloped ridge had sparsely scattered trees, and there was green grass as far as the eye could see. The Lich King told us to wait until dark. Thus, we sat on the hill overlooking the sea. In the distance, opposite the sea, there were different-colored silhouettes of farms, and some fortresses glimmering. The town of Brill was also faintly visible on the horizon. Sitting there, I tried to take in the smell of the grass and the seashore, but I couldn't smell anything. Arthas was right. I was truly dead. He had given me new power, as a servant, but a live servant. A live servant with no senses. I awaited orders, but there was silence. There was nothing to do but stare at the horizon and wait. As dusk approached, the Lich King beckoned us. We made our way on foot. None of us had a horse yet. We approached Brill, but we didn't enter the small town. Now I question why we didn't enter the town, but at the time, we didn't have thoughts of our own, or questions. We continued to follow the Lich King, moving through the tree line until we came upon a farm. On the far edge of the farm, we made our way to a grave. The grave had "Invincible" engraved on it. That was Arthas's old horse. It had been a very beautiful, pure white horse that he rode as a child and as a young teenager. One winter, an accident happened, and we never saw the horse again. There were rumors about it. How it had happened, what had happened. I never pushed Arthas to talk about it, and he didn't want to talk about it anyway. We all began to dig. The digging drug on for what felt like hours. Then my shovel hit an area that wasn't dirt. It struggled to push through. I wasn't sure what it was, so I struck again. My shovel hit the dirt much harder than previous swings into the dirt. To my surprise, a skull came flying up and barely missed my face. The Lich King looked at me and scowled. I must have struck its neck, and that sent the head flying. He brushed past me and picked up the skull. The Lich King held the skull in both hands and brought it ever so close to his own face. I thought he was going to kiss it. However, at that very moment he let out the words "Invincible," very softly and warmly. A strange feeling went over my whole body. I hadn't ever felt that way since I had been raised. It was warm and cozy. I pushed it back out, as it made me feel uncomfortable. His attachment to his old horse was coming out of him.
"Before you know it, we will be riding again,"
he said. He brought the skull back to the side of the grave we were digging up, and set it down like it was a piece of fragile glass. We were ordered to continue digging, but this time he said,
"Carefully,"
and gave me a warning with his eyes. We gathered the bones and carefully placed them in a pile next to the skull. The Lich King unsheathed his sword and raised it towards the dark sky. Strange magic channeled out of it. The bones were empowered. They moved toward each other, and uneven, unsorted flesh started to form around the bones. The horse came to life, and it arose with worms and dirt still around its neck. A very vile and shrill neigh came from its throat and out of its mouth. Its teeth were also grotesque and broken. Its eyes dark and sinister. They glowed right at me. Never before had I been so afraid. The Lich King didn't do anything for a few moments, and the horse continued to stare right into my heartless body. Arthas broke the silence and spoke to the horse.
"Welcome back to the land of the living."
He mounted the dead horse and rode across the field. My empty mind waited. There were no questions about what the master was doing. I guess now reflecting, he must have taken it for a ride immediately after not riding it for so long. Our silence was interrupted by the sound of a dog in the distance. Arthas hadn't returned, and there were no new commands. We remained standing by the grave. The dog was upon us, and so we slew it as quickly as it had come. Then a voice startled us.
Pick on someone your own size!
A pitchfork slammed against my neck, and I went falling into Invincible's grave. My father began to fight the man who came to investigate all the commotion. They fought blow for blow. The man swung with a one-handed pitchfork and parried with a small dagger. My father battled him with a large two-handed axe. In the fury, my eyes squinted, and then refocused. Who was that? Could it really be? It was Mr. Gothel, Artanion's father. Without warning, a dark purple laser grabbed Mr. Gothel by the throat, and he went flying into the field. The Lich King had come back and gripped the man by the throat. His death was imminent. When we came upon the Lich King and Mr. Gothel was laying on the ground, with his eyes frozen in fear as he stared up at the Lich King. He had now dismounted, and Invincible neighed and raised up on 2 legs. Then he came crashing down hoof first on Mr. Gothel. His hooves shattered Mr. Gothel's jaw and most of his teeth. As he began to choke to death on his own teeth, the Lich King raised his sword and beheaded him. His blade then consumed Mr. Gothel's soul. We were no longer fighting for Lordaeron, but what were we fighting for? Was this why we didn't enter Brill? Would we be sneaking around and killing peasants in the dark? Invincible walked a few steps forward and started drinking Mr. Gothel's fresh blood. When Arthas' steed had satisfied his thirst and mounted him, he led us to the stables where 2 horses were slain and raised for us. The 3 of us mounted and rose toward the palace. Arthas was now the Lich King, yet even with his new look, he was still recognized as the prince. The guards welcomed us as we made our way in. "I like your new armor and weapon, my prince," trailed out of a guard's mouth after us, as we marched up toward the throne, and we all kneeled on one knee. Arthas stood up and walked towards his father. He welcomed the prince, but then a strange look came across both Arthas and his father's face. He asked Arthas,
"What are you doing?"
Arthas paused and then responded,
"You no longer need to sacrifice for your people. You no longer need to wear the weight of your crown. I've taken care of everything."
Then his sword plunged deep into the old king's heart, and his body slumped to the ground. The sound of his crown bounced on the cold floor. Arthas picked it up and crowned himself King of Lordaeron. We left our position and joined him at his side. I was on the left and my father was on the right. Arthas sat on the throne. The Lich King and our master sat on the throne. My question was now answered. We would no longer sneak around in the dark. We would no longer kill peasants or horses. We were not fighting against Lordaeron. We were reforming it, remaking it. We were the new Lordaeron.
Chapter 11. Finding the Lich.
It was apparent that the Lich King was our master, but what we didn't know is that he also had a master. Soon it was time for us to head out on another mission. We made our way to an abandoned town where we were met by a strange wraith. He towered above us, wore a long cloak and a strange hood. His eyes glowed blue like ours, and his fingers stuck out, long and thin with pointed fingernails at the end. He brought with him vehicles that I had never seen. They would be needed for the assault. They appeared to be like catapults, but they fired balls of magic and other diseases instead of the usual fire or stone. We needed to raise an old vessel of the Lich King, who Arthas had slain when he was still a prince. That had been before the culling of Stratholme. His name was Kel'thuzad. He had been the leader of the Cult of the Damned and worked with the old Lich King, who now communicated with Arthas. It was strange, but at moments Arthas would stop and listen to the blade. At first I couldn't figure out what was happening, but then I realized that Arthas never gave me his own orders. There were moments of silence, Then words and orders pushed into my brain. Arthas often looked at the blade before speaking to me. The new command was to find Kel'Thuzad's corpse and raise him again. Yet he couldn't be raised anywhere. He needed to be raised by a great source of power. First, we needed to retrieve his remains. Then find an adequate urn to hold his body. Lastly, we needed to find the source to raise him. Our first mission was to find his burial site. We headed west from Lordaeron and were met with a strong resistance by the old members of the Silver Hand. As we approached and battled, they scolded and reproached Arthas.
I can't believe we ever called you brother,
they said.
You've made a mockery of the Silver Hands.
They spewed. Their broken and defeated bodies fell down. Their eyes stared up at the sky, taking in their last moments before true death. They called Arthas a spoiled prince and spat at him as they died. Eventually we made it to a catacomb, where Arthas began to commune with the spirit of Kel'Thuzad. We gathered the remains and pressed forward. Our path was blocked by a vile dreadlord. He reminded me of Mal'Ganis, except he was red in color. I thought we would be fighting him, but he spoke to Arthas as if Lordaeron's former prince were his own servant. Arthas listened to him as if he were too, and he was told that the remains were in bad shape. They must be put in an urn because our last step would be at the end of the long trip. We needed to head to Quel'Thalas and use the Blood Elves' Sunwell to raise him, so we had to head deep into one of the Paladin's strongholds to get the urn that would be needed. Once again, we pushed through areas heavily guarded by the old Silverhand members.
Glory to the Scourge,
screamed Arthas, now being consumed more and more by the Lich King's power. We followed him and cut down paladins left and right, burning their towns and fields on top of their fallen corpses. Another high-ranking paladin rebuked Arthas as his last moments spat out of him.
You are not even fit to carry your father's name. Why Uther ever vouched for you is beyond me. You deserve a gruesome death, boy.
His threats and anger were met with a swift death, like all of the others.
Light have mercy on you. This is how you repay Uther's loyalty?
Questioned another as his life wisped away. The bodies of the Silver Hand continued to pile up, cluttering roads and dirtying our boots as we made our way to the end. At last, Uther himself stood before us. It was the moment I had been waiting a long time for. We stopped some feet from him. Intense eye contact caused my anger to fester. I felt as if my grip would break my sword handle in two, or maybe just melt it altogether. Arthas broke the silence and stepped forward.
Your father ruled this land for 70 years, and you've ground it to dust in just a matter of days.
Very dramatic, Uther. Give me the urn, and I'll make sure to kill you quickly.
The urn holds your father's ashes, Arthas. What were you hoping, to piss on them one last time before you left his kingdom to rot?
I didn't know what it held, nor does it matter. I'll take what I came for, one way or another.
With Arthas' threat, we charged forward. Other remaining Silverhand members who had been hiding in the woodwork came to Uther's aid. Sparks flew and danced off of our blades and axes. Maces smashed and ricocheted off of shields. The sound of plates shifting and being bashed deafened my ears. Arthas got the best of Uther and he collapsed to the ground. But he had one more thing to say before he died.
I dearly hope that there's a special place. I dearly hope there's a special place in hell waiting for you, Arthas.
One would think after finally killing someone you hated would feel gratifying. However, it didn't simmer. Seeing the old man's corpse on the ground caused my anger to disappear. He had died shortly after receiving grave wounds. His lips had settled and his eyes had shut. Now it was like he was sleeping. He was harmless, and all of my anger from the charade at the Paladin training grounds escaped me. Words rushed into my mind again. There was no time for anything more. We opened the urn and threw King Menethil's ashes on the ground. Those ashes were replaced by Kel'thuzad's. Now we had a long journey ahead of ourselves. We headed to the Blood Elves' lands for Kel'thuzad. I had never been there before, nor had I seen a Blood Elf. I assumed that they looked like Night Elves, but perhaps they were red. After several days of traveling, we arrived on the outskirts of the city of Silvermoon City. Silvermoon was the Blood Elves' capital, and it blocked the path to Kel'thuzad, where the Sunwell was. There were some magical defenses, but we marched forward anyway. Arthas had a spy who helped us remove the runes from one of the wards, and we pushed forward. At this point, the Blood Elves came to defend the runes, and to defend Silvermoon. They were a little bit shorter than Night Elves. Their skin was lighter, and they had brighter hair, usually pink or blonde instead of green or purple like the Night Elves. They began burning ground we took, but we continued marching. Eventually, we made it to the walls of the city, and our machines knocked the gates down. We marched through and were harassed by archers along the way. One ranger named Sylvanas Windrunner led them. When we finally finished ravaging the city, Kel'thuzad lay wide open for us to enter. However, Arthas had vengeance on his mind. We had had a lot of trouble with the archers, and now we had captured their leader. She was tortured and then killed, yet she was not allowed the peace of death, as Arthas raised her as a banshee, and as his personal assistant. Now she was only called Sylvanas, and she was no longer a beautiful elf. She was now a scourge banshee. Upon entering the Sunwell, we dropped Kel'thuzad's remains and began resurrecting him. His body was laced with blue and white coloration. He wore a robe and hood like the wraith we had met before we had started the mission. His eyes glowed like ours, with blue. A raspy sound escaped his throat as he spoke. He told Arthas about his next mission, explaining that the Scourge was only the vessel of a much greater power. Another powerful demon, even more powerful than the Dreadlords, had been the Lich King's master, as the Lich King had been Arthas's master. Kel'thuzad's demonic master came from another world, and they were called the Burning Legion. There were demons who sought to destroy Azeroth, and it was the Scourge's job to summon their second-in-command to Azeroth. Our next mission would be to go to the magical city of Dalaran to retrieve the book of Medivh, and to summon the second-in-command of the Burning Legion, Archimonde. Arthas had a history in Dalaran. That's where he had gone in his late teenage years and met a girl who he fell in love with. He pulled a locket out from underneath his armor, staring at it for a few moments. Then he ripped it off, breaking the chain. He placed it deep inside a part of his plate armor, farther away from his heart. The look in his eyes narrowed. He stepped forward. I thought that on that day his love for his past lover waned, and his love and passion and focus on his mission solidified. The Lich King was taking complete control. There was no turning back now.
Chapter 12. The Battle for Mount Hyjal.
With Kel'thuzad raised, we headed south of the city of Dalaran the following morning. It was where Arthas had spent much time training, and met a mage named Jaina. There had been many rumors and lots of gossip about them in Lordaeron. I glanced over at him as we rode towards the city. The locket was no longer around his neck, and I wondered if it was still tucked away in his armor. His eyes were narrowed. His movements were stiff, without emotion. There was no sign that he gave a damn about what we were on our way to do. With the Scourge trailing behind Arthas and Kel'thuzad at his side, we approached the city's gates. Wizards who had set up a defense field met us there. They warned us that they would kill any undead who passed through it. Kel'thuzad, who was also a master of magic, couldn't be so easily countered, and he told us that the 3 mages channeling the spell must die. Arthas made his way around slaying them as the undead waited, watching him patiently. When the aura dropped, the Scourge charged in. We showed no mercy to all those in our path until we reached our goal, until we gazed upon the book of Medivh. Kel'thuzad then surrounded himself with 8 flames. He stood in the center and began chanting demonic words and channeling a summoning spell. Tichondrius, one of the Dreadlords, arrived and helped us defend Kel'thuzad from the Dalaran defenders as they swarmed in to stop the spell. It finished after 10 or 15 minutes, and a Dreadlord, even bigger than Melganis or Tichondrius, appeared. His voice boomed as he stood high above us. He told Tichondrius,
"We no longer need the Lich King. You Dreadlords will now command the Scourge."
Arthas looked discouraged and immediately got impatient. Kel'thuzad warned him and tried to encourage him, saying that there may be need for the Lich King in the future. Archimonde created his own spell and crushed Dalaran to the ground after we left it. He crafted a large dirt version of the city and then ran his fingers through it, wrenching and choking the life out of the city. Like voodoo magic, the city collapsed in the background. I awaited the words and commands from the Lich King. They never came. Arthas had ridden Invincible back towards Lordaeron, as the rest of the Scourge followed Archimonde and the Dreadlords to Nordrassil. They had their eyes set on the World Tree. Archimonde boasted that he would drain it of its life, which would give him immense power. Both the Horde and the Alliance showed up to fight the Scourge and their demon masters. I was shocked to see orcs fighting alongside humans, welcoming each other and acting like nothing had ever happened. I couldn't wait to make these humans pay. Had they forgotten what the orcs had done before? It must have truly been a desperate hour for them. Wave after wave of us charged into them, but they destroyed each wave of the undead and continued to press us back. I rode on an undead griffin and swooped down from time to time and caught the unsuspecting Alliance or Horde combatant off guard. After the quick kill, I went back to the sky. Even with my easy victories piling up, we were being beaten. Slowly at first, and then gradually we suffered heavy loss after heavy loss. We were pushed back all the way to the World Tree, where we were preparing to flee or make our last stand. Archimonde, who was siphoning the World Tree, stopped and rebuked us. He said,
"Watch how a real champion deals with a pack of fleas."
The remaining Alliance and Horde charged forward. A few of us sat in the air watching on our undead griffins and other undead drakes. Archimonde was a powerful being. He hoisted up challenger after challenger high into the air, smashed them with his fists, kicked them backwards, and cast spells from time to time. In desperation, a night elf pulled out a horn and began calling other hidden allies. Millions of wisps came out of the trees. They swarmed around Archimonde and then blew themselves up. The explosion rocked my undead griffin and sent me tumbling. I gripped the reins hard and in a panic dug my knees and heels into its sides. We went flying but with no direction in mind. The explosion had rocked Archimonde's body. He was desperately trying to kill wisps, but in a matter of seconds, his life winked out. All the other Scourge on the ground lay dead. Some of the Scourge had fallen from their mounts in the air, and others that remained flew in opposite directions. Yet we had nowhere to go. Nobody was calling us. No one was ordering us what to do. I flew around aimlessly. It was dead silent, like the middle of the night in the center of a cemetery. There were still no orders, no missions, nor any signs of life. I was all alone. My memories of Lordaeron flushed back through my brain. If it was all over, I should go back to Lordaeron. I had come upon a group of boats, so I had to find one to get me back there. As I approached a small dock, everyone fled. I chased one man down. His hands waved quickly back and forth in front of his face. He begged me not to kill him. I only asked,
"Can this boat take me to Lordaeron?"
He replied that it could take me anywhere as long as doing so spared his life. We beached several days later. The area was not familiar to me. It was a small beach with towering mountains above it. I thanked the man, who was more than happy to be off, and he sped away across the water. After scaling the mountain, I traipsed around the woods and up other hills and mountains for what felt like days. One evening, approaching dusk, I came upon a clearing and there were voices.
A quick death like the one you gave me? No, you're going to suffer as I did. Thanks to my arrow, you can't even run.
It was Sylvanas, the elven ranger, who had given us so much trouble in Quel'Thalas. So much trouble that Arthas had raised her as a banshee to punish her for being stubborn. She had shot Arthas in the heart. He wasn't moving, but was still mounted on his steed.
Give my regards to hell, you son of a bitch,
was the last thing she said before she was interrupted. Her banshee guards were cut down by a lich. It was Kel'thuzad. I hopped out of the shadows to help him defeat the last few of them, and Sylvanas fled.
I'll never stop hunting you.
She screamed as she sped away into the shade of the sunset. Arthas, Kel'thuzad, and I sat around a fire later that night. Arthas stared into the fire. Kel'thuzad's tongue was not as silent.
The Lich King is losing his power,
he began.
We must head back to the Northrend and reach the frozen throne at once. The Dreadlords turned on us, and you have also witnessed who else turned on us. Many undead have joined Sylvanas. It is a great pleasure to see we still have at least one death knight.
We gained our rest for the night, and the next morning Arthas and I boarded a scourge ship heading to Northrend. As we left the beach, Arthas turned towards Kel'thuzad and gave a parting request.
See to it that my legacy remains.
Once again, I was boarding a ship with Arthas. Once again, we were going to Northrend. His words entered my mind again as we sailed back towards the icy wastes.
Chapter 13. The Frozen Throne.
My feet flew through the air vertically and slammed into the water with a thunderous crash. The water rose up past the top of my boots as I slogged towards the shore. They pressed deep into the sand, one after another. We had arrived in Northrend. It was sunnier than I had remembered. Only Arthas and I made our way to the shore. He was walking leisurely for a man in a hurry. My eyes traced the sea and the horizon, as no words entered my head. I looked around, enjoying the surroundings. The sea sparkled, and the sand was a color between white and a light peach coloration. I took a deep breath. I missed the smell of the sea. I imagined that the beach still had the usual horrid smell that simmers alongside any seaside. Arthas's hand grabbed my shoulder to stop me. I hadn't noticed that I had walked past him. His fingers clasped around, and his index finger extended towards the other end of the beach, only 20 yards from where we stood. There were half a dozen elven guards. They called themselves blood elves, but they looked like high elves, much like the ones we had killed before in Silvermoon City. They told Arthas that his reign was over. They barely got those words out before an enormous being came burrowing out from the ground and sliced two of them down with its gigantic front claws. The being had a medium gray skin color, huge golden and purple armored plates over most of its important parts, and eyes that glowed darkly. We joined the beast in his attack, and soon all of the blood elves were corpses, and pools of blood waded below them, draining towards the sea. The beast called himself Anubarak, and offered his services to the Lich King. Arthas told him that he had to get to the frozen throne as soon as possible. Anubarak replied that there were several armies assaulting it, and that he knew an underground way to arrive much faster. This underground world was called Azol Nerub, and it was a long journey through it. Winding trails and rocky walls invaded our perception. Huge webs hung from rocks, across combined sections, and others wrapped around unlucky victims. Other webs were thick and stretched over long distances. They could hold all three of us as we traipsed across. The beast jumped down into a hole. Arthas and I peered down the hole and then heard a splash. Arthas then jumped. I was hesitant, but then had to jump to keep up with them. My weight was drugged down quickly, with gravity, my armor plates and sword helping the descent. The clap of water would have hurt if I weren't already dead. I guess I was no longer dead, but I felt no pain anyhow. As a death knight, I had been raised to live again, yet I had died, so I couldn't figure out if I was dead or alive. I didn't have much time to ponder my state with words pulsing into my head. "Hurry up," they boomed. As I approached, swords and other weapons clashed. I jumped into the fray and helped Arthas and the beast take down their foes. They were spiders, bigger than I had ever seen in my life. They were only the first of many as we cut our way through spider after spider, until we finally saw light peering in the underworld from a distance. It radiated against the walls, turning them yellow, and at the end there was piercing whiteness in the center. As we exited Azol Narub, Arthas reminded us about his haste. Then he grasped his chest and let out a groaning sigh. He went down on one knee and listened.
"It's the Lich King,"
he said as words entered my mind again.
"Our power and control over the Scourge has been restored."
We still had to go to the frozen throne, but a blood elf with a giant sword now stood in our way. A new Barak had already gone ahead, and it was only Arthas and I. He motioned for me to stay back and approached the elf.
"I took your woman. I held her in my arms at night. She tasted sweet when I kissed her, Kel. She
loathes you now. You sicken and disgust her, Arthas. Anything she felt for you has since turned to hatred."
Fire flew through the sky. The mage channeled and cast fireball after fireball. Arthas grimaced and staggered backwards. This elven mage was Kel'thuzad, the son of the king who had been murdered by Arthas and Kel'thuzad, the same place he had slain Sylvanas. With all of the fire blazing, Arthas's fingers pinched near his nose and spread across his eyes. His legs bent as he crouched. The mage sprinted forward and swung his sword back. He was prepared to deal the killing blow to Arthas. I sprinted towards them to save him. The word no quickly repelled me. The Prince of Lordaeron fell on his back and his knees pinched closely to his chest. They exploded forwards and upwards. The elven mage went sprawling backwards. Arthas towered over him.
"She hates you now,"
Kel'thuzad said one more time. Arthas extended arms as high as he could towards the sky and brought his sword down with all his might. It was buried deep into the snow. The mage had disappeared.
"Damn teleportation is for cowards,"
was his reply as he pulled his sword back out of the snow. We pressed on towards the frozen throne. The frozen throne cast a shadow on us as we approached it. There was one more barrier standing in our way. It was another elf. This one had strange markings, horns, and glaives. I couldn't believe it was an elf, but Arthas insisted that it was.
"It's a damn demon hunter,"
he said.
"Let me handle it again. Do not interfere."
The snow crunched, and then the sound of boots clumping on glass sounded as Arthas made his way towards the demon hunter.
"I've had these glaives for 10,000 years. How long have you had your weapon? Spoiled prince."
The elf mocked Arthas. This proved to be a big mistake. Arthas's hands gripped the Frostmourne tightly, his eyes tensed. He charged straight towards him. The battle was short. The elf lay bleeding to death in the snow.
"We haven't got much time. Hurry,"
were his only words of victory as we raced past the dying elf towards the frozen throne. There was the throne, encased in ice. There sat a helmet inside, with an essence that was formed into a body, held together by the ice. The metal-on-metal sound vibrated into my eardrums as Arthas drew out the Frostmourne. Both hands gripped the handle. He swung it backwards, then lunged forward and downward. The ice broke like a glass hitting the floor after being dropped by a drunken man. The essence went straight for Arthas and entered his body. He staggered backwards and then focused in on the helmet that lay on the ground. It was the final step to morph the two into one. Arthas, the Prince and King of Lordaeron. The Lich King, the Master of Ultimate Power. My prince, my childhood friend moved with his back stooped, and his fingers outstretched as they twitched from side to side. They grasped the helmet, and he threw his hair back. The helmet was lifted high into the air and came down slowly and tightly onto his head. His eyes were shut. His whole body shook. Was it a morphing, or was it a total possession? His eyes opened and they shone bright blue. The eyes were glowing and piercing the darkness around us. He was the Lich King, now and forever.
Chapter 14. The Scarlet Crusade.
The day we left Arthas behind often plagues my mind. Electra's eyes swelled with anger, her hands tightly gripping her sword's hilt. No doubt, about to follow Arthas into Stratholme, to follow his every command. I couldn't believe the amount of rage she must have had for Uther, and how this was clouding her decisions, leading her to slay and kill her own people. In the coming weeks there was much debate. Technically, the Paladin Order had been disbanded, and Uther had been relieved from his command. Yet we were still alive. We had weapons, we had lands, and a desire to survive. Opinions flew through the air like birds flying north for the spring and south for the winter. There were some people who sympathized with Arthas, or even different kinds of undead. Some wanted all undead cleansed from our lands of Lordaeron. It was hard to say who the leaders were. Uther was still very much respected, but he had retreated back to the center of Lordaeron, done with politicking, preparing for what was coming nonetheless. At the time, I was very afraid of the undead, so I thought the best group to join would be those utterly opposed to the undead. We gathered in small pockets that slowly grew larger. We called ourselves the Scarlet Crusade. It was due to our goal, a crusade against the undead, and we had no problem killing as many beings as possible to do it. There was no fear of painting the ground red with their blood. Our uniforms were red and white, with a giant red flame in the middle of any tabard and a red L, with the sword like the Lordaeron emblem on any flag or banner. The outposts were generally bastions and small towers. However, there were some towns and fortresses that we also controlled. I was stationed at a small outpost a few miles from Brill. From time to time I had to patrol, and I got to hear speeches from some of the leaders.
We are gathered here today because those who stand before me believe in the same cause. Destruction of the undead. Some of Lordaeron have come to sympathize with the undead because they believe they have free will, because they believe some bit of humanity remains in them. I am here to tell today that all undead are evil, and they must be cleansed with the light. Scorched to the ground until they repent.
Talon Fordring was one of our commanders, and believed in the Scarlet Crusade's cause. His emotions overpowered him and led him to raise his voice and support the Scarlet Crusade at every turn. I don't have a problem with passionate people. I don't believe it's a crime. As time passed through, the murders, the court cases, and executions didn't seem right. There were executions of those who spoke out or disagreed with the Crusade's methods, and one day I read one of their recruitment pamphlets.
Pick up your sword and bring all who side with darkness down. Join the Scarlet Crusade. Let's purge this land and make it pulse with the light again. The Crimson Dawn draws near.
A cold sensation went up my spine, and I gritted my teeth slightly. I'm sure my pupils widened, and then I tossed the pamphlet away. I tried to forget about it and decided that day to do some more exploring around the tower on my break. I hadn't been able to do that for so long. Being caught up in my routines of patrolling and guarding had drained me of my old desires. It was time to get back to the things I enjoyed. It would also take my mind off the Scarlet Crusade's methods and help me forget that pamphlet. I went around behind the tower and stopped. There was a ravine, only a short distance away. It didn't take long. I made it to the side of one of the ridges that led down into an abandoned valley. It was truly beautiful. Dark green trees, leaves of orange, yellow, and some were even red. Different shades of green bushes and tall, short, and medium-height grasses, thorns, and weeds cluttered the bottom of the vegetation. I took a deep breath to take in the nature. I was met with a foul odor, and I coughed violently. What was that? There on the ground there was a corpse, and another, and another. The ravine was filled with dead bodies. The smell was so awful, I was afraid to take another breath through my nose. There were bodies of dwarves, humans, and night elves. It was my first time seeing some of the non-human races. Their last moments were plastered on their faces. Silent sounds now escaped from their mouths. I couldn't find a single face I could stare at for very long. It was horrifying. Many of them with their heads severed, a few with tight rope marks around their throats. Other corpses were torn with many chest wounds from stabbing or shooting. They varied from being half decayed or skeletons or bones. A couple were fresh. I rushed forward to one side, and the body was still warm. I grasped its shoulders with my hands and drew it near. The warmth of its body baked my hands. Perhaps it was still alive. Then its eyes opened. No words escaped, only groans that were like words but didn't make any sense. The eyes settled at being half opened. It was a night elf. It was a female night elf. I wondered how much longer she had to live. The night elf wore fine linen robes and had the most innocent-looking eyes and pure face I had ever seen in my life. I struggled to talk to her because just moments before I thought she was a corpse. I stuttered out a few words. What happened?
I came too close.
Too close? Too close for what?
The Scarlet Crusade.
Her eyes closed and I shook her. Her eyes remained closed. Her arms slumped. I moved my fingers along her neck. There was no vibration coming from her veins. She was dead. I didn't even know her, but that didn't stop me from feeling compassionate for her. It is strange to meet someone for the first time, only a few moments before they die. I lowered her body and was pondering what to do when I heard a commotion in the distance, up the ridge. I raced up to investigate. As I arrived at the top, I saw another fellow crusader fighting with a peddler from Lordaeron, both swords clashing, dancing. I charged into them and knocked them both down. What are you two doing? What's happening?
This is a heretic, an undead sympathizer, a spy.
I am just on a journey to get supplies for my family. We haven't heard anything from Lordaeron, the king, or anyone for weeks.
He's a liar, a spy. He's coming close to our fortifications and I saw him writing something down.
It's a map. I was noting something on a map.
Die!
The crusader lunged with his sword at the man's neck, but he dodged it. I kicked the crusader back and then drew my own sword. I fought side by side with the traveler, and it was too much for the other crusader to handle. Slowly we made successful stabs and slashes on his legs and abdomen. We hacked his arm until his sword dropped to the ground. However, he kept fighting. He kicked me in the groin and I fell back. He grabbed the traveler's sword with his remaining hand. It dug into his hand and he bled but held on. The traveler pulled out a dagger and slammed it deep into the crusader's throat. Blood poured down his chest and also out of his mouth and dripped on the ground. I stood up as the traveler pulled the dagger out, and the crusader slumped face forward to the ground. The traveler and I met eye to eye for a few moments. He was probably wondering why I had helped him, as I had the same uniform as the man we had both slain. I put my sword back into its sheath to show no aggression. I didn't say anything. The traveler then turned around and walked briskly. A safe distance later, he took off in a full sprint. I let the traveler go because I felt he was innocent. I understood him because our group had become so unpredictable. Yet I still thought, with a reasonable explanation, my superiors would understand. Maybe I could also ask them about the corpses in the ravine. In my trusting and naive mind, I wasn't aware of what harsh consequences were on the horizon.
Chapter 15. The Argent Dawn.
It was probably a mistake helping that traveler, or even worse, helping a traveler kill a member of my own faction, yet it felt like the right thing to do. That's what we were really supposed to be doing here, right? Fighting for good, not just supporting our factions. As time went on, more and more people forgot that. When I approached the Scarlet Crusade leaders and told them what had happened, I was immediately arrested. My feet barely caught the stairs, as I was marched deeper into a prison hold in the main fortress. The guards were going at a fast pace. They had the benefit of having free hands and the confidence to catch a wall or rail if they fell. My hands were tied, and I struggled to keep up in these dimly lit hallways and staircases. They unlocked a cell and pushed me in. My arms were chained to a wall, and then I was left alone. The cell was empty, aside from a set of shackles across from me. It was also dark. There was a bit of damp water beneath my feet, some bones and other rubbish around in the corners. The cold shackles dug into my wrists, so I readjusted my hand position. Then they dug into my lower forearms. There appeared to me no comfortable way to sit in cold, bulky shackles. It felt like hours had passed when the guards brought back another prisoner. He had to be carried. They slammed his body against the wall. Then they hoisted up his arms and shackled him to the wall. One guard stood at a door with a torch to light the cell with. It was still hard to make out who the prisoner was. The guard's keys turned in the cell door's lock, and you could hear them walking away in the distance. I tried to reset my eyes so I could see in the dark. Every attempt failed me. After some time, my eyes finally adapted to the darkness. I could make out his dark body. It was then that I realized he was not human. But what was he? It definitely looked like a male. His hair draped over his eyes. He had different shades of skin color right next to each other. How could this be possible? He began to stir. You could see some kind of stitching that was holding his skin together. Was he a scourge? We had been fighting all kinds of undead, but I hadn't seen one like this before. Suddenly, I was frozen with fear as his eyes opened and met mine.
Have you never seen what you've been fighting before?
What?
There is no need to be shy, friend. We are both in shackles.
I'm only trying to figure out what you mean.
Have you never seen a Forsaken before?
A Forsaken? The Scourge? It doesn't matter what you call yourself. I was only trying to figure out what you are. I didn't realize they stitched you together.
Yes, we have many methods.
You Scourge are disgusting.
You are a typical human. You obviously don't keep up with the times. I am not a Scourge. I am Forsaken.
Do you think a new code name makes you any less loathsome?
I do not control others' emotions and feelings towards me. I am Forsaken. We are Forsaken. We have fought against the Lich King's power and control. With our new freedom, we choose our own path. There are many leaders, outfits, but the Forsaken is the one I follow. That is the difference between the Scourge and the Forsaken. We have the ability to follow our own will, not the Lich King's will.
This is so chaotic. There is infighting, and now you believe yourself to be different. You do realize that all humans see you as scum of the earth. Nobody cares.
And what the hell are you doing here then, Mr. Captain Righteousness?
What?
What is a human doing in a Scarlet Crusade cell?
It's none of your business, plebeian.
It is odd they would put a human in here, especially with an undead bastard like me. Aren't you afraid I might get hungry?
What are you going to do? Extend your neck like a giraffe? We are both in shackles and far apart.
There is probably a reason for that.
What are you trying to get at?
What I just said. And were you thrown here for failing some kind of crimson examination? You do seem to be pretty slow.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I already seem to know more about the Scarlet Crusade than you, human.
I was in the Crusade. They stripped my Crusade colors and threw me in this cell.
There you go. That wasn't so hard now, was it? Why would they strip such a righteous, upstanding man such as yourself?
I killed another Scarlet Crusade member.
I killed a man? What a classical answer coming from an inmate in prison.
There's a good reason for it.
And what's that? Was it over a woman? A sloppy, dripping, melted crotch often consumes men's souls like dark magic. You humans are truly detestable. Yet I remember when I had warm flesh and bones, I fell for these weak games too. Such a regrettable time.
I wish it had been over love.
Money? This story is getting even better.
No, I was defending an innocent traveler.
Wow, I am amazed. I am looking at a hero. I wish I could applaud you, but my hands are tied. So tell me, does saving some random innocent person's life to be tortured and executed yourself feel grand?
I thought the Scarlet Crusade leadership would respect my decision and praise me.
Someone kill me. Someone, please kill me. This is too much. I guess being so deep inside this group, you haven't realized how radical they truly are. Let me tell you something. You don't ever stop a Crusade member from doing anything, especially if it's being done against a non-Crusader.
I realize that now.
You are smarter than you look.
It's my turn to ask a few more questions.
You might as well. I love questions. I used to work for an Inquisitor.
What is this Forsaken thing about?
Why? Do you want to join?
No, of course not. I would never set foot in such a disgusting order. I answered your question seriously, so how about answering mine?
How desperate are you? How far are you willing to go for an answer?
I stopped and stared at the creature for a while. He only smiled back at me and said nothing. My body's temperature slowly rose inside the cold cell. I swung my foot as hard as I could at him. He laughed. I pulled my shackles and chains as far as I could, and then swung my leg back again as far as I could, and launched it forward like a catapult. It came within inches of the bastard's nose. A new look appeared on his face.
Nice try. Very close. Very close. Okay, human. You have entertained me, so I will entertain you, but I will only reveal a few things about the Forsaken. We have been following a Banshee, who was the first to break free from the Lich King's control. Later, she started recruiting us. We have been fighting with another group of humans to take on the Lich King. At the same time, we are still dealing with the Scarlet Crusaders. At the moment, they are the only humans fighting us. When I was captured, the group of humans with us had broken deep into the ruins of Lordaeron.
The ruins of Lordaeron?
That's correct. Arthas destroyed Lordaeron.
What?
They really do keep you cooped up in this outfit, don't they? Arthas returned from Northrend with a few new gifts. He also took up the Frostmourne and linked himself with an Orc warlock, spirit inside an entity called the Lich King. He can blast things with ice, summon all sorts of undead, raise any human he kills as a scourge, and much, much more. He brought along a few new Death Knight friends. They killed King Menethil and destroyed the palace. That spoiled prince also raised Silvermoon City, where he killed our leader and raised her as a banshee. Oh, and he also killed his mentor, Uther, too. He's quite a little bastard, isn't he? And to think us citizens of Lordaeron once admired him.
I was at an absolute disbelief. I hadn't been able to keep up with the news while in the Scarlet Crusade, that was true. I couldn't believe things were this bad. Arthas had not only committed genocide in Stratholme, but returned to Lordaeron, Silvermoon City, and gone on murderous rampages there as well. He killed his own father, and Uther too, one of his own mentors, his own flesh and blood. It was too much to handle, and I couldn't go on speaking. The undead prisoner, bored by my new awkward silence, slipped into a deep sleep. His snoring rocked the cell. I was left to sit alone, thinking to myself. I had so many questions now.
Doubts, sadness, and other feelings smothered those questions. The turning of keys in the cell door's lock interrupted my thoughts. I had been so focused on the new information that I hadn't even heard the guard's footsteps coming. Their rough hands grabbed me and escorted me to a courthouse. It was midday. Inside the cell, it had been impossible to tell the difference between night and day and to know what time it was. In the courthouse, they went forward with a speedy and unfair trial. The entire room was clad in scarlet red. The judge looked like someone you wouldn't want to mess with. There was no sense of emotion about him, besides anger and punishment. His skin was wrinkly, his hair unkempt and oily. His eyes stared for miles everywhere he looked. He definitely looked like someone who loved giving harsh sentences and speedy executions.
Infidel, heretic, murderer, how do you plead?
Not guilty.
Not guilty? Preposterous!
Bloody heretic!
And defiance against the crusade!
Make his turtle strong!
Nobody mocks the crusade and makes it out alive! Nobody mocks the crusade and makes it out alive!
Order in the court! Order in the court!
He was attempting to murder an innocent traveler. If I didn't murder him, he would have murdered the traveler.
How do you know the traveler was innocent? Do you know him personally?
No. He just seemed normal.
They all seem normal. Only the true devout can tell who is secretly stricken with the plague, who is evil, who is up to no good. They can easily trick and fool the weak and simple-minded.
A true man.
Speak the truth.
My God, Emperor and King!
Someone give this man a crown.
King of the human world!
Stamp on this ant
and make his gut and blood bleed out. Give him the hardest torture. We love to see those who oppose us die. We love to see those who oppose us die. We love to see those who oppose us die. We love to see those who oppose us die.
Silence! Everyone in this court, silence! Especially the coward who stands before me. You are found guilty and sentenced to death. Tomorrow at dawn. Think about your last words. Court dismissed.
I was escorted back to my cell. To my surprise, the undead prisoner was no longer there. I didn't have time to wonder where he went. I contemplated my last few hours alone. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do. Would there be any last words? What would I say? What could you say to a crowd of loony fanatics? They probably don't remember anything besides the mantras they scream every day, or the ideas they repeat. My thoughts were lost in a slumbering haze of darkness as I drifted off to sleep. The ground shaking awakened me, then the loud clap of thunder. Was it an earthquake and a storm all at once? It continued long enough for me to wonder if I could get used to it. Earthquakes didn't last this long, and the repetitions of the thunder were so perfectly lined up and sounded the same each time. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a storm. It was cannon fire. Someone was assaulting the fortress. The sound of gunshots were soon heard. Cannon fire continued to rock my cell walls. The friction broke my shackles bolts against the wall. I put my ear to the wall, to the floor. There was no window, but I tried to listen and figure out who it was. After a while, the sound died down. Only the sound of gunfire was heard. Then it was quiet. I looked out of my cell door. All the guards were gone. I worked on the bars and wondered if there was a way out of the cell. I was so busy working on cell bars that I didn't hear someone approach the cell.
Where is my son?
I was startled, and to my surprise, there was a man standing there. I wasn't sure what to say to him, or who he was. He wore gray, golden, blue, and silver colors. He looked important. He pushed his sword through the bars at me. I stepped backwards and stared at him. The wrong words uttered could be my last. He chopped the lock apart and burst it into the cell. He grabbed my shirt firmly, twisting it close to my neck, and pressed me up against the wall.
Do you speak common, boy? Where is my son?
Who is your son?
Talan Fordring.
Talan. I hadn't seen him for ages, especially after being arrested. For my freedom I lied to him, and said if he promised my freedom I could show him. I continued to lie and said he was usually in the main keep, with the other leaders. He chopped my shackles. We rushed to the upper area of the fortress, and nobody was to be found. Looking out into the courtyard, our eyes met bodies strewn everywhere. Our investigation of the corpses brought forth no fruits. The man's eyes sank in despair, but then lightened up when we saw a body in the distance, near the trees of the forest. The man rushed forward and knelt before the body.
Talon!
It was Talon. He had a knife in his heart and was laying on the ground. His body was cold. He had been there for a while, maybe a few days. Flies buzzing around him, his body losing more and more color. Yet a corpse, no matter what state it is in, is still loved by its father. The man knelt closer, not saying anything, stroking back Talon's hair. His glazed eyes stared back. They stared back in the horror of betrayal. It was as if he was not expecting to be stabbed in the heart, but I guess no one is ever prepared for that. I left the two to be alone, the grieving father with his son's corpse. I was never good at dealing with emotional people. I never knew what to say to them either. What can you say to someone grieving over his or her dead relatives?
Chapter 16. The Battle at the Chapel.
I had wandered away from the old man grieving over his lost son, up to an old hideout, a rise in the ground above a thick bunch of trees, then through some bushes that grasped at my clothes. My boots were the only thing left on me that was in good condition. The pants that clung to my legs for dear life hadn't been changed while I was in the cell. The Scarlet Crusade upper garments had been stripped by the captors and left me with an old tailored white shirt. It was soaked with sweat and had been on me even longer than the trousers. I smelled like trash, or maybe as bad as the corpses I had found in that ravine that sent me on this strange journey. I followed the ridge for a while and came upon the main road. There was some commotion a bit farther down the road. I made my way through the woods along the road. I saw it was the old man, Talon's father, battling one of the Scarlet Crusade's leader who had escaped. The Crusader was Azilian, an old high priest of the light. Now he was a master of the Crimson Light. It was no longer used to heal, but only to harm. They traded spells, and Azilian blocked blows from the old man's blade with his staff. Any wounds either of them received were quickly healed. In the distance, I could see several well-armed Scarlet Crusade guards coming. My eyes danced, looking around for a weapon. There was a scythe used for wheat that lay against a tree. It was abandoned and slightly rusty, but there were no other options. I grabbed it and waited for the guards to get close. They were running a few steps from the tree line, so I laid in wait to ambush them. As they arrived close to my position, I jumped out. My weight and the element of surprise quickly brought one of them down. I shattered one's cheekbone with the blow, and then used the back end of the blade to bash his skull in. The other drew his sword, and we began to battle. The old man noticed me struggling to battle his sword with the rusty old scythe, and then he sent a monstrous kick that knocked Ascillion backwards. He rushed over and drove his blade deep into the guard's back. Then he drew it back before the body recoiled, and severed his head. I hopped out of the way with the scythe just in time to avoid the body and the head coming my way. We both charged forward at Ascillion, who had just gotten back to his feet. The old man battled with him again, sword versus stave. I hacked at Azillion's feet with the scythe. In no time at all we took him down. My scythe's wounds left him grounded, and then the old man beheaded Azillion. He and I spoke no words, only examined the corpse for quite some time. He broke the awkward silence.
I'm glad to kill such an evil human being. I'm also glad that you know how to swing a weapon.
It's my pleasure to be of service. It was the least I could do for you, since you broke me out of that cell.
Don't waste your gratitude on such minuscule actions. I was in a hurry and I was ready to save my son. I failed, but I saved your life. The light prevails and always knows the way.
That it does, and I was glad to help you get your vengeance.
Vengeance was not what I sought. He blocked my escape and wouldn't let me pass. Unfortunately, we were forced to come to blows.
My apologies. You have a much kinder heart than me.
Where did you get your blade training, if you don't mind me asking?
I got my paladin training in central Lordaeron, near Brill, with Uther and his paladins.
Uther, I miss him. He was a beacon of light. That Don Arthas has turned into such a terrible human being.
I used to look up to him.
We all did. However, those days are long gone. Forget any feelings you had for him. The real Arthas is gone. 100% gone. He is a monster, and one day he will face his reckoning.
There was a long pause in the conversation. The man stood staring in the sky for a while. Then he looked back down at me.
You say you're a paladin?
That's correct.
The Argent Dawn could use more men like you. I'm Tyrion Fordring. I guess you knew my son as part of this unfortunate outfit. You also helped me against those Crusaders. Make your way to Light Hope Chapel sometime. You'll always be welcome there.
I had followed the King of Lordaeron. I had loved and followed Arthas until he sought to kill an entire city of innocent people. I had followed a new outfit, who were paladins and other members of the Light. Now I was supposed to join another so easily, they could end up being just as fanatical. I wasn't sure about heading to Light's Hope Chapel just yet. In a way, I just wanted to be done with training and fighting. I dropped the scythe and I walked through the remains of the Scarlet Crusade stronghold. There were still some of the invaders standing around. I had neither the Scarlet Crusades nor the Argent Dawn's colors on, so they mostly paid me no minds. I approached the woods on the far edge of the stronghold and began walking through the trees. Eventually I came to a clearing alongside of a river. It took me a few moments, but the trees and rocks along it as well as the bends of the river were very familiar. This was the river Electra Swain and I had built a bridge and crossed so many years ago. I walked down alongside it in hopes of finding the old bridge to see if it was still there. The sun was sinking further and further below the horizon, and my hopes were sinking with it. Then my eyes rose up. They narrowed to double check. There was a dam in the distance. Upon further investigation, I gasped with excitement about what I found. It was not just a dam. They had built a dam around our original rock bridge. I briskly walked across and followed the same path we had followed years before. There was the island. There were still some bones, but I doubted that there would be any orcs. It was quiet, almost like a cemetery. It was close to being dark, so I gathered materials for a fire. Small sticks, medium sticks. Then I had to find some big logs to keep the fire going. I had no axe. I also had no weapon, which made me think about the orcs, undead, or even bears or wild wolves. I stopped to sharpen a long stick on a rock, followed by gathering the last few materials I needed for the fire. As the fire was burning, something inside my stomach burned as well. The sides vibrated and my stomach growled. I took the stick and waded out to the islands. There I sat on the rocks and tried to stab some fish in what remained of dusk. There were a few which I managed to puncture. It would be enough for the night. I lay next to the fire deep into the night, listening to the crackle of the fire, the owls hooting, crickets chirping, and enjoying the moment of peace. I must have drifted off when I was wakened by the sound of deer running. It ran by the fire, and it wasn't stopping for anything. Only a medium-sized buck. I couldn't imagine what could be chasing him, especially at this time of the night. Behind me I heard a sound I recognized. The wail and screech of an undead ghoul ripped through the dark air of the night. I wheeled around and stabbed it with a sharpened stick right between the eyes. Deep into his brain I drove the stick deep inside. I was quickly smothered. There were more and more ghouls and undead monsters. I kicked, pushed them into the fire, stabbed at their eyes and other body parts. Eventually everything went black. I awoke staring up at a ceiling. I couldn't tell where I was. I tried to sit up, and a sharp pain pierced into my back. Both of my arms were sore. My legs were cramping as I tried to move them. My eyes gazed back towards the ceiling when a voice spoke to me. You're lucky you had that fire going, it said. I made a huge effort to sit up and forced my way through the pain this time. There was a man standing there. He was a member of the Argent Dawn. He had their colors, silver and black. I was out late too. I came to your fire and saw the undead swarming you. You know, you really shouldn't be fighting the scourge with a sharpened stick. I chuckled at him and thanked him, then asked where I was. He told me my bed happened to be in the infirmary at Light's Hope Chapel. I was nursed back to health, and the Argent Dawn soldiers were very hospitable. One day the peace was interrupted. Soldiers were running everywhere. I sat up in my infirmary bed and waited. One of them ran up to me and handed me a sword. Head to the armory and grab what you can. We have to have every able body out there fighting. The Lich King's strongest Death Knights are here, he screamed as he continued running down the hallway. I put my boots on and raced to the armory. There I grabbed a helmet. There was also shields. I took them both and the sword and headed outside. There were thousands of scourge everywhere. Death Knights, ghouls, abominations. There were mounted Death Knights as well as the ones on the grounds. Some wetness from the sky hit my cheek. More and more dropped. I looked down at my hands. There was blood on it. How was I bleeding already? A quick glance of the sky revealed that it wasn't my blood. It was raining blood. We fought outside the chapel tooth and nail for every piece of ground. Metal clashes on metal, sung through the air. It went through and sliced at flesh. Helmets were dented. Other helmets and shields crashed to the ground. The blood rained down on us as more blood dripped out of wounds or dead corpses. After hours of fighting, the Scourge commander dropped to a knee. Tyrion Fordring walked out. He scolded the Death Knight for being foolish enough to attack Light's Hope Chapel. The ground shaking interrupted him. A strange sound hit my eardrums. There stood an even more imposing Death Knight, more grotesque, larger, and stronger. It must be the Lich King, was the first thing that came to my mind. He infected Tyrion with some kind of dark spell. The great paladin couldn't move. He stood there choking as the Lich King continued talking. He was rambling about his power and mocking all of us. Without warning, the original Scourge commander tossed his own blade at Tyrion and it broke the spell. The commander's corrupted blade was cleansed, and Tyrion gripped it. He charged forward at the powerful commander and drove him back. Before retreating, the Lich King threatened Tyrion and all of the Argent Dawn.
When next we meet, it won't be on holy ground.
The battle was over. The Death Knight commander offered an allegiance to take down the Lich King. The Death Knights called themselves the Ebon Blade, and they formed an alliance with the Argent Dawn that day forward. Witnessing Arthas as the Lich King firsthand was a mortifying experience. He immobilized a powerful paladin within seconds. He sent his own men to a holy chapel to die. He didn't care about their lives or anyone else's. Tyrion was right. Arthas was far gone, and he was no longer himself. He was the Lich King. Perhaps we'd all die. However, we had to at least try to challenge him before we succumbed to his power. That's what I remember thinking that day. What would I like engraved on my tombstone?
Chapter 17. The Argent Crusade.
With the war continuing on and more stories about Arthas' transgressions, I found that my morale was slipping. The best way I've found to get over heartbreak in emotional situations is by keeping busy. The Argent Dawn had united with the other bands, formed the Argent Crusade, and were having a tournament to practice before they launched their final attack against the Lich King. I made sure to be as active as possible at this tournament. If I wasn't participating, I helped in any way I could or sat in the arena and watched the competitors. The Argent tournament consisted of jousting duels between factions and races from around Azeroth. The Eastern Kingdoms, where Lordaeron lie, as well as Kalimdor, which was across from the Eastern Kingdoms, had all of their races and factions involved in the tournament. Kalimdor was a continent I had never visited. It was the new home for the Orcs, as well as their Tauren and Troll allies. While I wasn't dueling, I helped in any way I could, polishing shields, weapons, and even boots, helping newer Crusaders get their equipment on and the like. I had signed up for the newest tournament, and a squire sprinted up to me to let me know that I would go on in 20 minutes. I gathered my armor, shield, and lance, mounted my steed, and trotted towards the arena. When I arrived, there were several attendants helping up a beaten challenger. He had several wounds and a shattered shield. His weapon lay several feet behind him. The arena was huge, and there were 8 mounted challengers who stood around on the edges. Twice each hour, a person who had signed up would enter in the middle and challenge one of the champions. I did a quick skim around the arena. There was an orc, a blood elf, a tauren, a forsaken, a human, a dwarf, a gnome, and a night elf. Taurens and dwarves were known to be defensive fighters, and a real tough fight. Therefore, I wouldn't call on them. Humans and orcs were aggressive. That could be their downfall, or they could quickly end you. I chose a blood elf. He looked weak and like an easy win. It would be a great way to impress those watching as well as fighting. He galloped towards the middle, and I waited, staring at him. The trumpet sounded, and he charged forward with his lance extended. I whipped my horse around and galloped away. There was a gasp in the crowd and murmurs. The blood elf stayed close on my horse's heels, but soon I gained some distance on him. Then I wheeled around and charged. The surprise attack widened his eyes, and his body went flying backwards off of his steed. This meant that the battle was over. It was only a jousting tournament that ended when one rider was knocked off of their horse, or if their horse was killed or could no longer continue. There were several fights daily as I progressed through the tournament. It was never ending, though. There was no winner, only weekly duels with win and loss records. My cracked smile turned into a real smile as dark thoughts of past losses from Lordaeron tucked back deep in my memory. The day came where we would make our assault on the ice-crowned citadel, which was a fortress where the Lich King was located. The whole time during our tournament we could see it in the distance, towering over the mountains. It was one of the most grotesque-looking buildings that I had ever seen. It was dark blue with a strange teal tint. Sharp and aggressive-looking points were shooting out at different angles. Along the bridges and roads there were more pointed peaks of serenite metal. Serenite was one of the strongest metals known to the world at the time, only countered by titanium. It was not only used for Lich King's walls, but also for our own soldiers' armor and weapons. The Argent Crusade's battering rams clapped hard against the gates. If you weren't there to see it, you might have thought it to be thunder. There was a grinding and cracking sound as they finally gave way. It was like opening a gift from someone on one's birthday. Inside our gift there were swarms of undead waiting for us. We cut them down, and within a few hours we created a base of operations. Our front lines held back the undead's constant attacks. Mostly these swarms were the most novice of the undead armies. Pawns would be a proper term for them. A few mornings later, our commanders decided to make a strong push. All of the men in the assault gathered around, and upon the command to charge, we barreled forward. Some of the new opponents towered above us, and we sliced through them as we had the others. Giant spiders and tarantulas that would torment me in dreams for years to come dropped down. These spiders were 3 times as large as an adult horse, and they spewed poison, tossed giant webs that were thick as ropes. We fired rifles, bows, and arrows and chopped at their legs. We severed their heads, and we finally made our way to a new opening. Inside there was pure ice on the floor, and frost drooping from the ceiling, and more frosted ice choking the walls. There sat a gigantic, disgusting frost wraith. He had no legs, and a vicious-looking face. His huge teeth and humongous ice-like scythe caused a strange icy chill to go throughout my body. I looked around and could tell that the same feeling must have been going on inside the others. As we entered to face him, he sent a blast along the floor that rose ice and imprisoned one of our comrades. While some worked on cutting him out, the rest of us fought the beast. As time went on, we fought only for survival and hoped that he would fall. Arrows ricocheted off of his ice. Bullets slowly chipped it down, and blades sliced and chopped at his body. He finally fell. There were several losses, but we were only glad to still be alive. Considering it a victory, we made our way back to the base of operations. A sentry was sent to the room to keep guard, and the rest of us got a good night's sleep. The next morning we clambered along the stairs in this room to see what else was waiting for us in this frozen hell. Once in another room there stood a lich-like woman. She was very tall, taller than the first beast, yet she wasn't that intimidating looking. Many undead minions sat in meditation. They were so deeply in meditation that they didn't notice us. We caught them by surprise as the Lich Woman stared at us. After we finished off her minion, she gave us no chance to recover or plan a solid attack. She began summoning minions again. Spiders, wraiths, and gigantic Viking-like warriors, and more, appeared from thin air like magic. Not only did we have to deal with her, but also with her minions. She channeled spells and surrounded herself with a magic barrier. We continued to strike at her, and her mental capacity wore down. After that, it was an easy kill. She let out a shrill scream as she died, and cursed us all for eternity. In the distance, there was a strange hum. There's some kind of magical elevator. Most of the men rushed forward to it, but the rest of us stayed behind to explore the room. We moved along the walls, hoping to find a secret passage or other clues about the place. The walls were frozen solid, and without the ice, they were already very hard and compact. I thought to myself, there's no way any of these are moving. However, my own secret doubts were silenced when I heard a man call, "I found something." We all rushed over to him. He was pressing on a wall and it was moving backwards. Inside it was pitch black. We slowly crept forward with torches. Almost tripping over our next find, we reached a stairwell, and past the stairwell a hallway continued. The two other men went up the stairs, and I promised to check the hallway. As I went along the hallway, blasts of wind started coming from the stairs. My torch winked out. I tried not to panic and continued through the hallway in the dark. The walls had a strange bluish glow that allowed me to see slightly. There were strange scratches all over the walls. It was hard to say what the smell was like as it was freezing. The smell was musty though, and as I got accustomed to the cold, my nostrils opened up. It smelled like piss. The ground was damp, and I hoped that it wasn't some kind of open scourge urinal. As I crept along the wall, my heart beat loudly. My hands were shaking. The unexpected was even more terrifying in the dark. What I saw next caused me to freeze in my tracks. There were many sets of yellow eyes in the dark. The familiar sound of the wailing scourge sounded. I swung wildly, while trying not to overswing to give them any opening. I hoped that none of them had snuck in behind me, so I crept with my back against the wall. I chopped them down one by one. Bright glowing yellow eyes were their downfall. Soon the sound stopped, but there was still a pair of yellow eyes in the far corner of the room. Yet this scourge sat there, in the corner, eyeing me. I walked closer, and I stopped. It stared at me, and I stared back. What was this? What was wrong with this scourge? It made no sound, and didn't attack. I pondered. Swain! Swain, is that you? The scourge crept towards me. I didn't say anything more. It led me back down the hallway, and then it moved its hands along the wall. The hallway began to shake, and an opening appeared. The scourge looked back at me, and then bounded down the new opening. I yelled at my comrades, and they came running down the stairs to see. It was a pathway around some of the forces, and it led to the next level. We went back to the soldiers guarding the bottom of the stairs and told them of our discovery. As the others rushed off, I approached one of the priests and told him what I had discovered and what I suspected about this scourge. I asked him if there was anything that could be done. He pulled out a few books and started skimming through the pages.
Chapter 18. The Fate of Swain and Electra.
The main Argent Crusade force followed me to the secret room and down the pathway that the scourge had showed me. Along the hallway there was a strange room. The shape was indescribable. Only lines and checkered marks that had no end or connection. The scourge had selected 5 definite points. Brainwaves rushed to and fro as I tried to remember them. Then they lit up. The wall began to move to the side. Several of the men following laughed and then cheered. As they pushed up the stairs, I told the priest to follow me. Our footsteps thudded on the way to the corner where I had found the scourge. There was no conversation. Lips were sealed tight. I was thinking about Swain and the times we had had together, in the stables, at the palace, in Stratholme, and on our fateful journey. I hadn't thought about him for quite some time.
I contemplated if there was any way it could have been avoided. There was still hope for him yet, though. If this priest could work some kind of a holy miracle, he was as silent as I was. But what was he thinking about? We arrived at the place I had found the scourge previously, but couldn't find any trace of him this time. I tried other walls for new passages. The priest stared at me in silence. Now I not only had the pressure of finding a passage in hopes of finding the scourge, but also the pressure of someone watching me. Someone who probably wondered what the hell I was doing. At last one of them opened. Inside there was no lights, only darkness. Not even the walls that had reflected in the hallway were shining. It was a chilly, spacious room. In the corner I saw it. Yellow eyes that shined in the dark. I went forward to the right, and the priest pushed forward on the left. Cornered, he couldn't fight back or run, the priest told me. He quickly shackled the scourge with chains of light. They were beaming yellow and white. They lit much of the corner and partially illuminated the rest of the room. The shackles alone caused the scourge to wince. The priest then poured rays of light into him. The rays were circular and sometimes like lines. They were slightly transparent and disappeared deep inside the ghoul's body, firstly hitting the top layer of his flesh and fur, then disappearing altogether. The scourge yelped and shrieked like the sound a child makes when they accidentally touch a hot fire. Now imagine someone forcing them to keep their hands there, but their hand only receives the pain, not the effects of the fire. Goosebumps went up my arms and skin crawled on my neck as I couldn't believe the amount of pain and torture the priest was inflicting on him. He continued for quite some time when I spoke to the priest. "Stop! It's no use. I don't think it's working."
"I think you're right. If this is your friend, he will be a scourge forever. Of course we could end his misery if you were to oblige."
"No, that is too much. Let him live as long as he can in his current state. Allow me some time to console my old friend, and then I will rejoin you."
"I will be waiting. May the light be with you."
"And also with you." The sad reality set in. There was no bringing back Swain. The priest unshackled him and walked alone down the hallway. I stayed with the scourge who collapsed from the torture, yet his eyes glanced up at me, and it let out a ghoul groan, which seemed to thank me. I decided to leave him behind. I quickly caught up to the priest, and we made our way through the secret passage up to the next level. When we arrived, there were corpses everywhere. Some of them were undead, some humans. We also found some orcs and forsaken shells sloped and strewn along the grounds. They were all dead. In the distance, the airship's engines hummed. Its hull was beginning to flow forward. We ran as fast as our feet could carry us and jumped on at the last second. The airship was really a ship with an aeronautical engine and a propeller. We had been in the air for less than 10 minutes when the commander yelled,
"The horde is coming hot and fast!"
Every cannon was filled with a body, and the rest of us prepared the grappling hooks. As soon as the horde airship was close to us, the cannons roared. Some soldiers hopped across through the air with rocket packs and grappling hooks, then started attacking the horde on the main deck. A giant lich appeared and froze our cannons. Meanwhile, the horde's cannons continued to fire. Those across on the horde ship cut down the lich as quickly as they could. The battle raged on, and the horde airship took a beating. Both engines were struck, and it was starting to descend. We climbed up the grappling hooks and cut the lines as the horde ship plummeted towards the ground below. Those still clinging to the lines ascended what remained of the rope. The airship coasted the rest of its way to the highest part of the ice-crowned citadel without any more incidents. There was a lone Death Knight waiting for us. However, it wasn't a human like most of the Death Knights I had seen before. This one was an orc. This orc Death Knight sent strange red magic towards the ground, and it heated up our feet as we walked on it. I could feel something rubbing up against my foot. It was some kind of worm, a worm covered in blood. It was disgusting. I swung my sword as hard as I could at the Death Knight in retaliation. We squashed the bloody worms with our boots, and blood exploded everywhere.
Looks of horror and disdain crossed the faces of most of the soldiers. An amusing smile crossed the sinister orc's face. Eyes glowing blue, he began to channel a spell, and then went into a bloody rage. Soldiers towards his front put up their shields in defense, as the rest of us swung around from behind and sliced at his ankles and calves. Archers shot from afar, and mages and warlocks cast their spells. He dropped to his knees. His body had had enough, and his face plopped down in front of his knees, and his blade clattered on the selenite-reinforced ground. It was over. A few stayed behind to tend to his body and reflect. The rest of us raced inside the citadel. There was frost gas flowing in the corridor closest to the front, so we moved as fast as we could. Inside awaited several different passages. In the first one, there was nothing but corpses. We were lucky because many men had been lost on the way to the airship and also in the fight with the Horde, and then again in the fight with the Orc Death Knight. Several men didn't make it past the frost gas either. The second passage was once again filled with corpses. Finally, we made our way to the last passage. The pipes below it pulsed with blue energy. The first two had pulsed with green and then red. In the entrance there stood a banshee with several undead by her side, and what remained of some of the Argent Crusade. The Forsaken had a purple banner with a white skullish face on it. It looked similar to the prisoner I had been with in the Scarlet Crusade prison. The banshee was different from the other undead. She wasn't a human. She looked more like an elf. She wore revealing armor and carried a bow and its arrows, which glowed purple and green. The Forsaken, behind the Banshee and the Argent Crusade, up against a wall, stood looking at each other, arms bared and ready to strike at each other at any moment. Then the Banshee spoke.
I'm the Banshee Queen. I command the Forsaken. We have both suffered great losses today, but they haven't been in vain. Much of the Scourge on this level are defeated or have fled. If you allow me, I can raise them and help us push forward. Or if you disallow me, we can wait here slowly for death.
Not a single human wanted to agree, but we had no choice. If we were to finish our deed, we needed as many bodies on our side as possible. We agreed to let the Banshee raise them. Several of the Forsaken's warlocks began summoning. Dark purple magic flowed from their fingers into a stone. The stone spread and a large lich appeared, who then approached the Banshee Queen. The lich raised its hands and white electric rays shot out of them, much like the hooded figure whom turned Swain into a scourge. These rays shot into the bodies of the undead, the humans, and the scourge death knights who lay fallen. The hallway began to shake, and they stood to their feet. The other Argent Crusaders gasped in horror and gagged on the smell. What a disgusting sight. Then I noticed that one of them had Electra's sword and shield.
My death had been welcoming, but was short-lived. What was this? I was coming back to life. There before me I saw my enemies. I charged forward, but then I stopped. There was no command. I heard nothing in my head, humming orders. What had happened to Arthas? Why was I able to think on my own again?
I could see her in the distance, with the other newly raised undead. They looked confused, and then the Banshee spoke to them.
I am Sylvanas, the Banshee Queen, the leader of the Forsaken. You have been given a second chance at life as undead. Your will is your own. You serve no one. You have no master. I offer you a chance to join the Forsaken and join our crusade against the Lynch King.
I'll never follow you, bitch. It felt good to call that foul Banshee a bitch. I never forgot her betrayal of Arthas. I would never follow her. The other freshly raised undead cheered and stepped to my side. We greatly outnumbered what was left of that wench and her Forsaken lackeys. I couldn't wait to sink my blade deep into her heart, or lob off her ugly little elven head.
The undead seemed to unite against us, but their moment was interrupted by more scourge crashing through. These undead were different than any I had ever seen. They were thin, yet muscular. They were tall and wore helmets, had large swords and axes, and some of them even had shields. The newly resurrected undead held their arms low and expected the scourge to take them back. However, they didn't. Their ugly heads bounced on the ground and rolled in the corridor. The final look of surprise in their eyes was almost depressing to look at. The Lich King's minions easily took down the first few closest to the stairwell they had entered from. The rest of the undead, including Electra, the Crusaders, and the Forsaken, charged. We quickly dispatched the Scourge group, severing their arms, smashing their legs, and dissecting the empty space where their hearts used to be. Electra looked back at the Banshee Queen reluctantly. There was still no verbal agreement, but there was no protest either. We toiled on, deeper into the citadel, together.
Chapter 19. The Downing of Arthas.
Most of the enemies now lay dead, but where was Arthas? We had fought our way through another corridor and into a small room, with still no sign of Lordaeron's old prince.
More undead footsteps echoed in the distance, and now giant spiders rained from above.
Chop off one head, another replaced it. Lob off another head, and more screeches and howls entered sharp corridors and wide open halls. They kept coming wave after wave.
Then all was still. We could hear each other's breaths and heartbeats. It was too quiet, and I waited in regal anticipation.
An eerie creaking sound came from the distance.
A gate slowly rolled up in the distance. How convenient.
It looked like some sort of trap. The Lich King didn't think any of us would be that stupid, did he?
Not a single human moved a muscle. Cowards. The Forsaken stepped forward and rushed towards the gate.
Our forces had no choice but to follow the Forsaken. We couldn't afford to lose them all in this trap.
The gate led to a platform. There was nothing there. The air blasted in, and there was nowhere to hide.
What was the point of this place? There was nothing here. Where was Arthas?
Where was the Lich King?
A gigantic undead frost dragon rose from below the platform and flew high above us.
Sindragosa. I really didn't want to fight her. She was almost too powerful for even the Lich King to control.
The dragon's ribs and other body parts were exposed, surrounded by frost magic, and she had huge glowing blue eyes. I could only imagine what sort of damage she would do to us, as we were at the edge of the frosty cliff, and the gate crashed down from behind. There was no escape.
She swooped down and began breathing frost onto us, freezing many soldiers in place. Some of them would never move again. I was sure of it. I dashed as fast as I could out of the way, and many others followed.
Archers began firing arrows at her neck and face. The dragon seethed and hissed as the arrows pecked into her flesh, like starving birds who hadn't eaten for weeks. Mages conjured up fire magic, and archers fired their arrows through the fire. The heat made the dragon hiss and shriek even louder.
She came down all the way to the ground and charged into the bulk of the forces. This sent several men retreating, and then she swung around, slashing and smashing others with her bony, sharp tail.
Now that she was on the ground, we pounced on her and began hacking and slashing at every limb.
If a clock had been there, it would have been ticking for quite a while. The dragon's fury was starting to wane. She tried to fly away, lifting her wings but only did an awkward hop, landing on the ground again. Blood dripped and drained from her wing pits. The webs were also shredding. She couldn't fly.
We severed her head from her body, and she shrieked loudly at us.
She screamed, "Free at last!" as she died. Finally, she was free from the Lich King's grasp. I missed that piece of death. Lying effortlessly in darkness, I didn't have much time to reminisce. Boots clomping and metal clanking refocused my attention. We made our way up a ramp that led to an elevator. I remembered it now. It was the way to the frozen throne.
A few moments later, we stood towering over all of Icecrown. The entire area was covered in ice. The platform that didn't have ice was as cold as a winter's pond. There sat Arthas by himself. With all his commanders and atrocities and scourge slain, he sat all alone.
Yet inside his grotesque helmet, I'm sure there was a smile. He stood up and walked confidently down towards us.
It felt good to be free, staring at Arthas, my childhood friend who had raised me from the dead and sought to have me under his control for eternity. Surrounded and outnumbered, he walked towards us. I hoped that he didn't notice who I was in my new form.
He taunted Tyrion, asking if he should surrender. He lunged his sword back and thrust magic towards Tyrion. The Master Paladin was imprisoned in a giant block of ice. Then the Lich King charged forward towards us. He swung his blade and kicked us back with his huge boots. He summoned undead and evil versions of ourselves. Some of us were wounded and weary. We fought on.
Arthas knocked me down and was set to ram his blade through my exposed throat when a ghoul jumped on his back. Even the Scourge seemed to abandon ship now.
Swaying, he was still alive. He ripped and clawed at Arthas's helmet, trying to gnaw and feast on his neck. Arthas threw him aside effortlessly and continued his attacks.
I had survived due to this Scourge. Were all of the Scourge turning on him now?
It wasn't long before Arthas was worn out. Seemingly tired of our games, he drew power from a giant spell. I blacked out for a second.
Darkness turned to blurry haze, and I saw Arthas channel purple rays into all of us. He said it was his plan all along to raise an army so powerful to take over the whole world. Was I dead again? Was he raising me again? I was getting tired of this. I wish I would just stay dead or alive for more than a moment.
Tyrion called on the light for one final blessing. His blessing was granted, and he broke free, leaping towards Arthas's blade that was channeling his spell. It shattered in two. It broke in many ways, and pieces of the shattered blade lay on the ground. Souls flew out of it. I saw a familiar face.
King Menethil, what was his spirit doing? Rays of light channeled towards our bodies, and we were resurrected. Blades and arrows and all kinds of magic smothered Arthas. King Arthas, the Lich King. He was now weaponless. Souls flew into him. How many souls had been in that corruptive blade? Thousands? Millions? They all gripped him tight and floated into the air. The souls were getting their revenge. Everyone alive and dead took their best shot at him in his weak state.
Beaten and close to death, Arthas fell to the ground, his helmet rolling away from him. Father, is it over?
Yes, my son. No king's reign lasts forever.
All I see is darkness. Arthas was dead. It was all over. So many lives lost. Cities and kingdoms lay in ruin. Where did we go from here? Lordaeron would never be the same. Most of its citizens were dead or undead. I still looked forward to leaving this icy northern land and going back home. No matter who possessed Lordaeron, the land would always be Lordaeron. It had been such a long, strange ordeal. How does one pick up a normal life after such a huge war? Such a long war? How a few months can feel like years. How a year can feel like decades. After being scarred by so many atrocities, how does one sleep at night? Even so, I would love to be in my hammock again, in our small cottage, with nothing to bother me besides the simple life of a stable hand. I couldn't wait to see my father again. I wonder how he had managed during this long war. Electra Swain and I looked out onto the horizon of Northrends. I had never looked at it so delightfully, but I still hoped that I would never have to gaze at it again.
Thank you for completing the audiobook Tales of Arthas. For more information about the Tales of Arthas fanfiction series, you can go to www.skgediting.net. There are also poetry books and fantasy books there, should you be interested. Profiles for the voice actors and actresses can also be found on the website in the Tales of Arthas section. Characters and who voiced them will now be read in order of appearance. Ertanian narrator, Samuel Gurman. Several voices. Lordaeronians, Elias Bural, William King, and Samuel Gurman. Mr. Gothel, Jeff Mullen. Mr. Barthas, David Montalvo. Electra Engthul, Human and Death Knight, Lindsay Bruce. Prince Arthas Menethil, Samuel Gurman. Swain Barthas, Charlie Hoffman. Ertanyan Gothel, character, Samuel Gurman. Lordaeron Guard, Thomas Bithell. Woman 1, Sarah Wright. Woman 2, Lindsay Bruce. Stormwind Child, Dominic Pelletier. Lordaeronian Child, Gavin Pelletier. Old Man 1, Bram Thierkill. Old Man 2, Nathan Ganley. Wallguard, Samuel Gurman. Paladin Master, David Montalvo. King Menethil, Thaddeus Walster. Scout Soldier, Nico Quinons. Scout Commander, Nico Quinons. The Necromancer, Gary Scales. Silverhand Soldier, Samuel Gurman. Electra Narrator, Forsaken, Christina Nichols. Mal'Ganis, Roy Healton Jr. Murmuring Spirit, William King. The Lich King, Rob O'Dure. Silverhand Commander and Troop, Samuel Gurman. Uther, Zaher Kamel. Archimonda, Warm Voice on Fiverr. Sylvanas, Catherine Black. Kel'thuzad, Matthew Wade. Kel'thas, Benjamin Shroud. Illidan, Benjamin Shroud. Talon Fordring, William King. Scarlet Crusade Recruitment Pamphlet, Nathan Ganley. Night Elf Priestess, Charlie Hoffman. Scarlet Crusader, David Montalvo. Innocent Traveler, Andrew Lopez. Undead Prisoner, Michael Moen. Judge, Aaron Cheese. Several Voices, Scarlet Crusade Audience, Catherine Black, Elias Bural, William King, and Samuel Gurman. Tyrion Fordring, Zaher Kamel. Argent Dawn Soldier, Samuel Gurman. Ghoul Noise, Rob O'Dure. Priest, Thomas Bithell. Airship Commander, Thomas Bithell. Preface, chapter titles, outro, and credits, read by Cassidy Brookins. Samuel Gurman thanks you once again for reading Tales of Arthas and listening to the credits list. He also thanks all audience members for listening to the audiobook, and the actors and actresses for their contributions to the project. For more Tales of Arthas and WoW fanfiction content and fantasy content, you can visit www.skgediting.net.